From Chimerica to the New Cold War. Elements in Hofung. Contents. 1. Introduction, Political Sociology of Global Conflict 1. 2. Symbiosis 5. 3. Intercapitalist Competition 25. 4. Spheres of Influence 47. 5. Conclusion, Inter-Imperial Rivalry Redux 62. 1. Introduction, Political Sociology of Global Conflict. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, politicians and academics hailed the coming of a new world order in which the United States would become the lone superpower. Fast forward to the 2010s, with the United States and China heading toward more confrontation over trade, technology, the South China Sea, Taiwan, and many other issues, the conception of a new Cold War has taken hold. Countries around the world are increasingly pressed to choose a side between the two giants. According to the notion of the US-China New Cold War, the increasing tension between the two largest economies in the world has been driven by a rift in ideology and political systems, a conflict between liberal democracy and authoritarianism, or a conflict between free market capitalism and state capitalism. Some casual observers attribute the escalating tension between the United States and China to the Trump administration's recklessness. But any serious analysis points to the reality that the rivalry runs deeper than a particular administration, predating Trump and continuing into the Biden administration. The rivalry between the two countries became apparent in the early 2010s. In 2012, Washington launched the Pivot to Asia policy that increased U.S. naval presence in the South China Sea to maintain what the United States and its allies regard as the open sea. This was in response to China's claim of sovereignty over the area and its increasingly aggressive military buildup there. The Obama administration also sped up the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. This free trade pact excluded China, with the intention of pressuring it to change its economic system, which is currently dominated by state-owned enterprises, open up its market as promised, and prevent its allegedly unfair treatment of American and other foreign companies should it seek to join. In 2014, when China launched the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank as a multilateral financial institution offering loans to Asia's developing countries, the United States saw it as a direct challenge to its hegemony over development finance via the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Washington chose to boycott the AIIB and called on its allies to do the same, though with little avail. Many would explain the US-China rivalry in terms of the antagonistic differences between the two countries' political, economic models. But a major problem with this explanation is that these differences have not emerged recently. Since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989 and the consolidation of Chinese Communist Party authoritarian rule in the 1990s, it has been clear that China would not become a liberal democracy anytime soon. It was evident that the country's authoritarian regime was consolidating, not weakening, during the 1990s and the 2000s. Some have observed that Beijing's new aggressiveness in foreign affairs, revived dominance of state enterprises, and redoubled attacks on civil society started in the Hu Jintao period. Yet these ideological and political differences did not prevent the United States and China from pursuing economic integration and geopolitical cooperation in the 1990s and 2000s. The symbiosis between the two countries was very strong, leading Niall Ferguson to coin the phrase Chimerica to describe the singular, integrated economy formed by the union between China and America. Likewise, some see the United States and China as having constituted a G2 as co-leaders of the world. Some long-standing China policy insiders in Washington, such as intelligence official and Trump China advisor Michael Pillsbury, argue US-China conflict was inevitable, as Beijing has always seen the United States as its enemy and its long-term goal since 1949 has been to topple US global leadership so as to establish its own world domination. True as it may be, this interpretation cannot explain why China hid its intention so well that Washington was not aware of it until the 2010s. It is noteworthy that many advocates of this view are leading voices that supported US-China symbiosis in Washington in earlier times. We therefore need to explain why the US China's symbiosis of the 1990s and 2000s suddenly turned into rivalry in the 2010s, given that the political and economic systems of neither country underwent any fundamental, qualitative change. For this, Graham Allison's thesis of Thucydides' trap seems to offer a clue. Drawing on the war between Sparta and Athens in ancient Greece, Allison observes a conflict between a rising power and an established power, which always jealously guards its status quo domination and seeks to hold down any new challenger, as an inevitable trajectory. Viewing the conflict between the UK and Germany and that between Russia and Japan in the early 20th century as precedents, Allison asserts that today's US-China relationship is heading toward the same destiny of conflict. From this perspective, the United States and China remained harmonious as long as China was weak and content with being the United States' junior partner. Once China reached a certain level of capacity and confidence, however, it began to show greater ambition, and the US started to see it as a challenger. Harmony then gave way to conflict. This notion regarding the nature of US-China rivalry has inspired much writing that characterizes the relation between the two countries as edging toward great power competitions. Allison's explanation is neat and seems convincing. But its interpretation of US-China relations from the exclusive lens of the competition between the national states begs the question of what role the myriad international institutions, in which both countries have been active, play in ameliorating or aggravating the tension between the two. This gap has been recently LLED by a new literature that complements the view on competition between great powers by bringing in the complexities of global governing institutions. These works put US-China competition in the context of the politics of global organizations, new and old, like the World Trade Organization, AIIB, and BRICS. They translate the question concerning US-China competition into that of whether China's rise is subverting the liberal norms and international order constructed under US leadership in the aftermath of World War II, or simply continuing it with the same principle of global multilateralism. Focusing either on competition between two individual states or how they shape and reshape norms and orders in global governing institutions, these works focus exclusively on geopolitics and stop short of addressing how the economic linkages between the United States and China contribute to their changing relations. They assume that states are autonomous actors in pursuit of power, world domination, or global governance. This assumption has been common in political science and political sociology since the Bringing the State Back in school reinstated the Weberian conception of state autonomy. From the Weberian perspective, an autonomous foreign policy elite's definition of national interest, and the policy orientation developed endogenously in the elite network, are the foundations for analyzing international politics. The foreign policy elite is composed of military, intelligence, diplomatic officials, think tank scholars, and elected officials with foreign policy interests. This follows Weber's assumption that state action on the international stage is driven by the sentiment of prestige and the pursuit of power position in the world. This perspective is a reaction to the Marxian perspective, which sees the state's foreign policy as a simple reaction of the economic imperatives of transnational corporations. Beyond statist and economistic views, there have been more nuanced theories of global politics that see competition between states and transnational linkages or competition between corporate organizations as two autonomous elves that interact to shape world order and conflict. In this element, I draw on insights from these theories to examine the origins of US-China symbiosis in the 1990s and 2000s and its mutation into rivalry in the 2010s by connecting geopolitical relations between states and intercapitalist relations between corporations. I will focus on the meso-level interaction of corporations and states between the United States and China against the backdrop of macro-structural shifts in the global political economy. Section 2 looks at U.S. strategies in the 1970s to cope with its economic and hegemonic crisis by building a neoliberal global empire. The attempt succeeded and the United States had an imperial moment at the turn of the 20th century that witnessed a revival in U.S. profitability and global power. Such success hinged in large part on the integration of China into the neoliberal global order. This integration was not predetermined, but made possible by a concatenation of interactions between the Chinese state and U.S. political and economic elites. The U.S. foreign policy elite started to deny China as a geopolitical rival after the end of the Cold War, in the early 1990s. However, the emerging coalition between the CCP and U.S. corporations turned the latter into Beijing's proxy lobbyists, restraining the U.S. state's geopolitical impulse to pursue a hostile policy toward China. Section 3 examines how capitalist development in China, just like capitalist development elsewhere, entered into an overaccumulation crisis aggravated by the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. This overaccumulation crisis, fomenting rapid debt growth and industrial overcapacity, drove the CCP and its state-owned corporations to revive profitability by aggressively squeezing U.S. and other foreign corporations in the Chinese market. Such confrontation pushed U.S. corporations, which used to take the lead in ensuring an amicable U.S.-China relationship, into stopping the restraint of the U.S. foreign policy elite's confrontational posture toward China. In some areas, U.S. corporations even sought the American state's assistance in intensifying competition with Chinese enterprises. Such a shift in U.S. corporate disposition toward China underlines the rising hostility between the U.S. and Chinese states over a whole range of issues after c. 2010. Section 4 looks at how U.S.-China intercapitalist competition in the Chinese market expanded into the world market when China's overaccumulation forced its corporations to expand overseas, in particular, into the developing world, at the expense of U.S. corporate interests and geopolitical influence. This intercapitalist competition on the world stage induced the Chinese state to start carving out its sphere of influence in Asia and beyond, intensifying the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. As the RST and second largest economies in the world, with combined GDP and military budgets constituting almost 40% and over 50% of the world total, respectively, the changing relationship between the United States and China is the most consequential change in world politics, determining the future of the world order, or disorder, in the 20th century. This element is as much an attempt to explain changing U.S.-China relations as it is a projection of where the global configuration of political powers is heading. In the concluding section, I explore possible scenarios of world conflict or world peace by comparing the new U.S.-China rivalry with the inter-imperial rivalry among great powers in the early 20th century. 2. Symbiosis. 2.1 U.S.-led neoliberal globalization. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States led the advanced capitalist world in pursuing a high-wage, high-welfare, and high-consumption model of growth with Keynesian regulation of the market. This paradigm of an activist government and working-class power fomented a long post-war boom in most developed economies. However, the boom ended in the late 1960s with the beginning of the stagnation crisis and corporations' falling profitability. The crisis originated partly from intensifying competition from European and Japanese manufacturers, which had fully recovered from the war, and partly from the extended period of rising wages driven by the power of organized labor. In an attempt to revive capitalist profitability, Washington ushered in the neoliberal revolution in the 1980s. The crux of the neoliberal solution to the crisis in the 1980s was taming organized labor through union busting and tightening monetary policy. Free trade policies that forced workers in advanced countries to compete with low-wage, non-unionized labor overseas was another key in suppressing the power of labor to demand higher wages. As such, the United States led the world into neoliberal globalization by opening its market to foreign manufactured exports in exchange for its trading partners' openness to U.S. investment. The result has been a massive exodus of American manufacturers to low-wage countries, where consumer goods were manufactured and exported back to the United States. These dynamics have also applied to other advanced capitalist economies, fomenting the rise of the global supply chain network, the bedrock of globalization. Since the 1980s, the United States has been running the largest trade deficit in the world, while every other major economy has been running a surplus, to varying degrees, as shown in Figure 1. In the neoliberal global economy, the United States is always the consumer of last resort. Its huge consumer market gives it important leverage to lure other countries into the global free market. The United States' role as the world's consumer of last resort originated from its unique political economy that historically favored consumption over investment and export. A unique feature of the U.S. political economy is its lack of value-added tax to repress consumption and encourage saving, investment, and export, a feature in most other advanced capitalist economies. The role of the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency since 1945 enabled and necessitated the United States to run a massive current account deficit with the world. To maintain the dollar's grip on the world economy, the United States has to provide the world with sufficient liquidity through the outflow of its currency. This is achieved through massive U.S. capital export and its equally massive trade deficit. Furthermore, the United States is the only economy in the world that can print more of its currency to cover its fiscal and current account deficit, given the global reserve currency status of the dollar. Despite the expectation of the collapse of the dollar's dominance following Nixon's abolition of the dollar's gold convertibility in 1971, the USD is still the hegemonic currency in international transactions and foreign exchange reserves. Worldwide, the euro ranks a distant second. After its gold convertibility ended, the longevity of the dollar hegemony relied on the U.S. global security umbrella. This enables Washington to pressure leading capitalist countries that depend on its protection to denominate their exports and foreign exchange reserves in dollars. Many developing countries were initially resistant to neoliberal globalization. Throughout the Cold War period, the dominant paradigm of development was import substitution and state-led industrialization. Many authoritarian regimes, left and right, jealously guarded their domestic market and restricted the entry of foreign capital, leaving the economy's biggest prizes to politically well-connected and monopolistic local enterprises, which often relied on generous subsidies from the state. To draw these developing countries into US-led globalization, the United States took advantage of the international debt crisis in the 1980s. When the Federal Reserve tightened the money supply to suppress organized labor and stagnation in the early 1980s, the dollar's interest rate skyrocketed to over 20%. This sudden surge in the USD's interest rate dealt a blow to many developing and Soviet bloc countries, which had borrowed heavily to finance their development and consumption in the 1970s. When these countries were on the verge of defaulting on their USD debt, the IMF and World Bank stepped in to offer emergency loans to keep them afloat. The loans were conditional on the debtor countries pursuing structural adjustment reforms, including privatization, capital market liberalization, and export promotion. These conditional loans became the instrument the United States used to pull many reluctant developing and Soviet bloc countries into the global free market. In sum, the US-led globalization project beginning in the 1980s was a remedy for the crisis of profitability across advanced capitalist countries. In 1993, when Clinton became the post-Cold War American president, the United States enjoyed opportunities to expand free trade into vast new frontiers in the formerly socialist bloc and in Latin America, where the emerging North America Free Trade Agreement was supposed to be the step toward an American free trade bloc. At the time, China was at an economic standstill and facing political uncertainty following the Tiananmen crackdown in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the common enemy that had bound Washington and Beijing since the 1970s, Washington re-evaluated its quasi-alliance with the CCP government and was not in a hurry to draw China into the orbit of globalization. Instead, the Clinton administration's foreign policy elite initially saw authoritarian China as a potential rival and prioritized human rights promotion in its China policy. The foreign policy discourse of China threat started to emerge in Washington, projecting China as the next major force that Washington had to confront and contain after the Soviet Union. Surging conflicts between China and U.S. allies in the South China Sea and the East China Sea in the mid-1990s, the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996, nuclear proliferation in Pakistan involving China, the United States bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and the U.S. spy plane's clash with the Chinese warplane in the South China Sea in 2001 all pointed to intensifying U.S.-China geopolitical tensions after the end of the Cold War. As China was unscathed by the Third World debt crisis, the IMF and the World Bank had little incentive or leverage to pressure Beijing to adopt structural adjustment reforms. China's incorporation into the global free trade order in the 1990s was neither a result of Western invitation nor of pressure. The CCP leaders themselves took the initiative to adopt market liberalization in the 1980s and to seek China's incorporation into the global free trade system in the 1990s. Beijing even mobilized U.S. corporations to move U.S.-China policy from an initial human rights-driven political confrontation to economic engagement. China entered the post-Cold War global free market by self-invitation. 2.2 China's quest for the global free market in the 1980s, China's market reform was driven mostly by agricultural decollectivization and the rise of rural industries or township and village enterprises, run by local governments. The TVEs employed surplus rural labor to manufacture consumer goods for the domestic market. Meanwhile, export-oriented industries started to grow in select southern cities that benefited from Hong Kong-based manufacturing capital in A. The export share of the economy remained small. After the bloody crackdown of Tiananmen, market reform and the economy stalled. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Deng Xiaoping pushed for continuous and bolder reform to restart economic growth in his 1992 Southern tour. Economic growth resumed, but high inflation and overheating ensued. Worse, state banks opened the floodgates, lending to local governments and state enterprises, thus fueling an investment boom that brought about growing indebtedness and trade deficit. The foreign exchange reserve fell precipitously when inflation surpassed 20%. Confronted with the economic crisis, then Vice Premier Zhu Rongji, who was in charge of economic policy at the time, moved to rein in bank lending. He tried to reorient the economy to one driven by foreign direct investment and exports as a remedy for the deteriorating trade deficit and shrinking foreign exchange reserve. To achieve this reorientation, he introduced a 30% depreciation of the Chinese RMB in January 1994 and disinvested from TVEs to release surplus rural labor for coastal export-oriented factories. The U.S. market has been the largest market for East Asian export-oriented manufacturing since the 1960s. It was also the largest market for the nascent export sector in China throughout the 1980s. For Beijing's attempt to shift China's economy to export-led growth to succeed, the U.S. market needed to remain open to Chinese manufactured exports at low tariffs. Just as the Chinese economy was at the critical juncture of moving toward export-led growth, however, U.S. market openness to Chinese products, an openness that had been in force since the United States and China established formal diplomatic ties in 1979, was put on hold. Immediately after Bill Clinton was inaugurated in 1993 as the first Democratic president in more than a decade, the post-Cold War foreign policy elite in the new administration, with the backing of human rights advocates who were not friendly to Beijing as well as organized labor that was not friendly to free trade, sought to link tariffs on Chinese imports to human rights improvements in China. The particular policy that the Clinton administration sought was to link China's improvement in human rights to its most favored nation status under the international trade framework of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. After World War II, international trade was regulated under GATT before it was superseded in 1995 by the World Trade Organization. Each GATT member was obliged to offer MFN status to all other GATT members, conferring exports from all members the same lowest available tariffs. During the Cold War, most communist countries were excluded from GATT, and U.S. trade law forbade the U.S. government from extending MFN status to these countries. After 1974, a U.S. president could grant MFN status to communist countries if the country allowed its people to migrate to non-communist countries freely. MFN status needed to be renewed annually by the White House. After each presidential renewal, Congress had 60 days to overturn the renewal, but the president could veto the overturn. A two-thirds majority of each chamber of Congress was required to override a presidential veto. When the United States established formal diplomatic relations with Beijing in 1979, the Carter administration immediately granted China MFN status. Throughout the Reagan and George H.W. Bush eras, the White House renewed China's MFN status annually without much controversy. Before the 1990s, U.S.-China trade was not sine qua non, and the United States renewal of China's MFN status was part of its geopolitical strategy to accommodate China's economic needs in exchange for cooperation in checking Soviet influence in Asia. When U.S.-China trade took off in the late 1980s and early 1990s, organized labor in the United States, as well as textile and other labor-intensive industries in southern states, began to voice their opposition to free trade with China. The challenge to the annual renewal in Congress of China's MFN status grew in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. After the bloody crackdown, anti-free trade activists, Democratic members of Congress representing organized labor, human rights advocates, and traditional anti-communist warriors coalesced to seek an end to China's MFN status. George H.W. Bush made it clear that he would use his presidential veto power to override any congressional attempt to stop the renewal. With Republican control of the Senate, the presidential veto should not have faced opposition, but the momentum in Congress was on the side of anti-renewal. In 1992, Congress attempted to add human rights conditions to China's MFN status renewal 3 times, declaring that China's failure to meet these human rights conditions would lead to the end of its MFN status. These human rights conditionalities twice passed both congressional chambers, only to be vetoed by President Bush. With the White House under the control of Republicans, who, since Nixon and Kissinger, had been committed to stable relations with China for geopolitical reasons, any Democratic opposition to the renewal of China's MFN status was futile. The situation changed, however, in 1992 when the presidential election promised a Democratic victory. During the election, free trade in general and China's MFN status became focal points of contention among the candidates. Republican George H.W. Bush, who ran for re-election, pledged to continue his administration's free trade policy, and this included the launch of NAFTA and the unconditional renewal of China's MFN status. Businessman Ross Perot ran as an independent on an anti-trade platform against NAFTA and the renewal of China's MFN status, while Democrat Bill Clinton ran on a centrist, slightly anti-trade platform. During the campaign, Clinton promised to add labor and environmental clauses to a NAFTA side agreement and also promised to stop the unconditional renewal of China's MFN status, making the renewal subject to strict human rights conditions. Clinton's position of linking human rights to the renewal of China's MFN status can be attributed to the human rights idealists in the diplomatic establishment ever since the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown. But, more importantly, it was a response to the economic concerns of organized labor, whose support was indispensable to a Democratic victory in the presidential election. Organized labor in the United States had been concerned about rising competition from low-cost, non-unionized labor in China. So the pledge for human rights conditionality regarding China's MFN status was thinly veiled protectionist opposition to U.S.-China trade liberalization. In the RST year of the Clinton administration, its foreign policy wing was LLED with idealists predisposed to the agenda of human rights promotion. They include Secretary of State Christopher Warren, U.S. Representative to the UN Madeleine Albright, and Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs Winston Lord. Democratic change in Soviet bloc countries encouraged the human rights idealists in the foreign policy establishment. Moreover, organized labor, which had been sponsoring congressional attempts to overturn China's MFN status under the Reagan and Bush administrations, felt empowered with a new Democratic administration. Thus, Clinton announced on May 28, 1993, that the annual renewal of China's MFN status would no longer be automatic. Instead, it would be linked to the result of a presidential review of China's progress in 7 areas of human rights, which covered the most contentious issues such as prison labor, the release of political prisoners, religious freedom, and the autonomy of Tibet. China's failure to improve on any 2 of the 7 areas would lead to the termination of China's MFN status. The end of the unconditional annual renewal of China's MFN status significantly increased American enterprises' uncertainty regarding China's business environment. China's tariff levels could go up drastically should the country lose MFN status in the coming years. Whether and how China would retaliate against American businesses already in China in the event of non-renewal was uncertain too. Regardless of the actual result of each annual review, linking MFN status to human rights conditions effectively put the brakes on further growth of U.S.-China trade and expansion of the U.S. corporate supply chain into China. China's attempt to move to export-driven growth had hit a major roadblock. Clinton's conditionalities invoked an aggressive lobbying effort on the part of U.S. businesses for a delinking of human rights from trade with China. Having long relied on the veto power of a Republican president to secure the continuous renewal of MFN status, by 1993-4 businesses started to mobilize to lobby the Democrats. At first glance, it seems that U.S. corporations lobbied against the human rights conditionality because they were either already operating in China and therefore hurt by this policy shift, or because they anticipated the future benefits of further liberalization of U.S.-China trade. An anomaly of these lobbying efforts was that, unlike many other occurrences of business lobbying where organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers led the way, in the case of China it was individual transnational corporations at the forefront of the lobbying activities. A further anomaly, as we shall see in the next section, was that many of the most active corporate lobbyists had no presence in China, thus, the nature of their businesses would not automatically translate into huge benefits from liberalizing U.S.-China trade. Furthermore, some corporations that eventually gained significantly from U.S.-China free trade, were conspicuously absent from the lobbying efforts in 1993-4. Back then, many U.S. corporations had not yet foreseen China's centrality in globalization. In the first year of the Clinton administration, the lobbying focus for most U.S. enterprises and business organizations was ensuring the passing of NAFTA. Keen supporters of globalization at that time saw NAFTA as the first step toward an American free trade bloc, and few saw China, still under communist rule, as a major new frontier of globalization. We can gauge the relative level of involvement of different corporations in the lobbying effort for the delinking of human rights from MFN status by counting the number of times that individual corporations were mentioned in the delinking discussion in the congressional records for the years 1993 and 1994. Usually, an individual corporation was mentioned in connection with the MFN discussion when a petition letter signed by the corporation was included in the record or when particular Congress members spoke on behalf of certain corporations' interests. The mention count of the corporations approximates to the varying extent of involvement of these corporations in the campaign. To verify the result, I also recorded the number of mentions of individual corporations supporting China's MFN renewal for the same period in the media, first in 3 major newspapers and then in all news outlets. The different counting methods coincided well. In all rankings, Boeing came out as the most active lobbyist for China's MFN renewal, closely followed by AT&T. In terms of their actual and potential relationship to U.S.-China trade, we could categorize all corporations into 3 types, as can be seen in Table 1, corporations that already had a vested interest in Chinese trade and would certainly benefit from liberalization, corporations that did not yet have many business links with China but could reasonably expect benefits from the liberalization of U.S.-China trade in the future, and corporations whose direct benefits from low tariffs in respect of Chinese exports in the U.S. market were uncertain given the nature of their business. Many corporations that did not yet have a stake in China but could expect benefits from the liberalization of U.S.-China trade, like Detroit's automobile companies, were quite active as China could become a big market for their exports. Those corporations that already depended on U.S.-China trade, most notably, footwear and garment retailers that had outsourced to Chinese manufacturers early on, were not among the most active in the lobbying efforts. Most puzzling is that a group of enterprises that did not have any connection to Chinese trade and would not have obvious, direct benefits from low tariffs for Chinese exports in the U.S. market, including telecommunication companies like AT&T, satellite companies such as Hughes Electronics, and energy corporation ExxonMobil, were among the most active in the lobbying efforts. Boeing and other aircraft makers also fall into this category because U.S. export of aircraft to China does not go through regular trade channels and needs approval by American and Chinese authorities on an order-by-order basis. Regulation of aircraft exports by U.S. authorities resembles regulation over the export of weapons and other sensitive technology deemed important to national security. As such, airplane sales are often linked to bilateral negotiation between the two governments. For example, the RST batch of planes that Boeing sold to China was in the summer of 1972, when there was no formal trade relationship between the United States and China. The sale was a direct result of Nixon's visit to China earlier that year. Corporations that had no direct connection with Chinese trade sent petition letters to the White House and congressional members, having already mobilized their employees to call or write individual letters to senators and House representatives in their districts. Many of these companies were initial campaign donors to congressional and presidential candidates. For example, AT&T was the biggest corporate donor among all organizational donors, contributing more than $2 million during the 1992 election cycle. As another example, Hughes Electronics was a keen donor to Clinton's presidential campaign in 1992. In late 1993, its CEO wrote 2 blunt letters to Clinton, reminding him of the financial support for his campaign and requesting that the White House reconsider certain sanctions on China besides the MFN issue. Organized labor, a key constituent of the Democratic Party, was opposed to the lobbying campaigns. Its influence contributed significantly to Clinton's pledge to link human rights conditionality to China's MFN status in the RST place. Another constituent of the anti-MFN renewal coalition was Southern textile industries, which did not want to see their competitiveness eroded by low-cost Chinese imports. Human rights activists and Chinese dissidents in exile were also part of the coalition. Torn between organized labor and corporate interests, in early 1994 the Clinton administration deliberated about renewing China's MFN status, even though China was nowhere near meeting the human rights conditions set in 1993. Concurrently, the rising power of the newly created National Economic Council in the White House significantly increased Wall Street's voice in the government's decision-making process. The NEC was created through a presidential executive order on January 25, 1993 and, in 1997, Clinton referred to as the single most significant organizational innovation that our administration has made in the White House. Robert Rubin, a veteran Wall Street banker and co-chairman of Goldman Sachs, was the council's RST director. The NEC was to centralize the decision-making process related to domestic and international economic policy and oversee the implementation of the decisions made. It was modeled on the National Security Council, which was created in 1947 to centralize foreign policy decision-making at the dawn of the Cold War. Sharing many members with the powerful National Security Council, the NEC managed to seize control, from the State Department, of policies related to foreign economic relations. With Rubin as head of the NEC, the views and interests of the financial sector dominated the administration. Joseph Stiglitz, member of the Council of Economic Advisers under Clinton and then chair, pointed out that the consideration of balancing different groups' interests in the economic policy-making process was abandoned, while finance, rule supreme and the movement of bond and stock markets became the primary policy guide. Likewise, David Lampton, based on his extensive interviews with Clinton-era officials, observed that he president and his economic advisors were exceptionally sensitive to movements in the financial markets. In the RST half of 1994, financial markets were reacting negatively to the prospect of deteriorating U.S.-China relations. The dominance of Wall Street's views in the White House magnified the power of corporate voices in the pro-China trade coalition at the expense of the foreign policy elite, who sought to use trade policy as a lever to undermine China's authoritarian regime. In spring 1994, the NEC, the State Department, and Democratic House of Representatives leaders openly feuded over China's MFN status. That January, NEC Chairman Rubin had expressed his support for unconditional renewal in the Washington Post and suggested offering China permanent MFN status. In response, senior State Department officials protested to the White House, claiming that Rubin's comments could weaken efforts by the administration to maintain consistent pressure on China to improve its human rights record. Nancy Pelosi, who chaired the U.S.-China Working Group in the House, also criticized the proposals for unconditional renewal, emphasizing that in the House of Representatives I think I can say unequivocally, that the support for conditioning most favored nation status for China on improvement on human rights in China and Tibet is solid. In the end, corporate and Wall Street power prevailed. On May 26, 1994, Clinton announced that he would renew China's MFN status without taking into consideration China's human rights progress, reversing his 1993 policy of linking human rights conditionality to the annual renewal process. Many House members tried to overturn Clinton's decision. On June 8 that year, conservative Republican Congressman Gerald Solomon put forward a resolution that would revoke China's MFN status despite Clinton's decision. Solomon's resolution was motivated by his staunch anti-communist stance, but it won support from some members on the left. One left-wing supporter of the resolution was Representative Bernie Sanders from Vermont, who noted that it is insane to be talking about most favored nation status for a country which allows for the ruthless exploitation of its workers. American workers cannot be, and must not be asked, to compete against the workers in China. The resolution was ultimately rejected by a wide margin of 75 to 356 in the House of Representatives. Besides the Solomon resolution, a group of mainstream Democrats in the House broke rank with the Clinton administration to sponsor a bill, on June 16, that put extra conditions on China's MFN status. The group included human rights advocates Nancy Pelosi and David Bonnier, a representative of organized labor from Michigan and the former party whip of House Democrats. The bill stipulated that China's MFN benefits should only apply to private enterprises and not include any military-related or state-owned enterprises. With the backing of some of the most senior Democrats, the bill provoked an all-out mobilization of corporations in support of China's MFN renewal. 307 companies and business associations co-signed a letter to Congress opposing the bill and supporting Clinton's unconditional renewal. The bill was defeated in the House by 158 to 270. 2.4 Beijing's invisible hand in Washington. The reversal of Clinton's policy on Chinese trade was a triumph of the business coalition over the coalition of organized labor, human rights advocates, the foreign policy elite motivated by human rights promotion, and labor-intensive industries in the United States. As we have seen, many of the leading corporations in the campaign, like telecommunication and oil companies, were not associated with direct benefits from U.S.-China trade liberalization. It is also intriguing that the lobbying campaign was undertaken by individual corporations and not coordinated by business associations, as is the case in many other corporate lobbying campaigns. The single most important force that brought the many corporations together into an effective coalition in favor of delinking human rights from trade with China was the Chinese state itself, which actively recruited and coordinated these corporations as its proxy lobbyists. Clinton's decision to link human rights conditions to China's MFN status renewal came at the worst possible time for China, just as the Chinese government resolved to steer its economy to export-oriented growth in response to the economic crisis of 1992-4. Therefore, the top priority of the Chinese government was to ensure that the U.S. market, the biggest market for its export industries, remained open at low tariffs. During the debate over Delanking, Democratic Congress members noticed that lobbying firms hired by the Chinese embassy on Capitol Hill increased their activities. But these direct lobbying efforts by the Chinese government were not effective and could have invoked a public opinion backlash. The most important means by which Beijing tried to tilt the balance of forces in Washington in favor of Delanking was its co-optation of major American corporations. As early as 1990, the economic counselor in the Chinese embassy in the United States, Huang Wenjun, sent letters to all major U.S. corporations, telling them to display your impact on the U.S. government, the Congress, as well as news mediums, do some promotion to maintain the MFN status with an aim to avoid the loss of bilateral interests. Likewise, a business writer for the Los Angeles Times noted that China's leaders are pushing American companies to lobby the U.S. government, and U.S. business seems a bit too ready to cooperate. Some of them lectured Secretary Christopher at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, criticizing his emphasis on human rights. U.S. sources provide few clues as to what Beijing offered to enlist American corporations to lobby the White House and Congress in 1993–94. A few reports show how Chinese officials explicitly used orders as a coercive means to demand that U.S. corporations lobby Washington on China's behalf. For instance, Chinese officials once warned Boeing that Chinese state airlines would stop placing orders for its planes if it could not demonstrate its efforts to lobby for policy in Beijing's favor. The company's international strategist admitted that the company would be toast if it did not. Boeing is an exception regarding its frankness about pressure from China. If they did receive similar pressure, most other corporations were reluctant to admit Beijing's influence over their actions, as it could easily invite charges of collusion with an authoritarian foreign government. Chinese state media, on the other hand, was not shy about reporting the Chinese government's efforts to enlist U.S. companies' assistance over MFN status renewal. According to the People's Daily, the number of U.S. business delegations invited to visit China peaked in 1993 and 1994. On many of these trips, U.S. corporate executives signed a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government involving big orders and contracts. The Chinese hosts often explicitly associated these deals with their American guests' efforts in lobbying for China's MFN status renewal in 1994. Besides these U.S. delegations to China, Chinese officials also toured the United States, visiting corporate headquarters to sign contracts or memorandum in reciprocation of their hosts' assistance over MFN. This explains the aggressiveness of lobbying by U.S. companies that had no prior business in China and had little direct association with U.S.-China trade. Among the corporations most active in lobbying for Delanking, many benefited from individual incentive packages offered by the Chinese government. The deals that these corporations obtained from China in 1993–4 are summarized in Table 2. Corporations with a vested interest in U.S.-China trade, such as retailers that had already started outsourcing to Chinese factories, lobbied for MFN renewal out of self-interest. Here, the Chinese government does not appear to have offered any additional incentives to solicit their help. For corporations with little direct stake in U.S.-China trade but with much influence in Washington, the Chinese government offered generous deals and Chinese officials were outspoken about these deals as rewards for the corporation's lobbying efforts. During the congressional debate, some members who supported Delanking admitted that the discontinuation of China's MFN status would jeopardize the lucrative contracts that China had offered individual corporations. For example, a Republican senator justified his support for Delanking by giving a laundry list of corporate contracts that would be voided should China's MNF status not be renewed unconditionally. These included Table 2 incentives offered by the Chinese government to selected leading U.S. corporations for supporting the unconditional renewal of China's MFN status, 1993–4. Corporations incentives. AT&T executives visited Beijing in spring 1993 to express their support for the unconditional renewal of China's MFN status and signed MOUs pledging comprehensive long-term cooperation with China. Boeing China placed $4.6 billion jet order from Boeing. ExxonMobil Vice Premier Zhou Jiahua visited ExxonMobil headquarters in Texas in April 1994 to thank the company for its support for China's MFN renewal and to sign an agreement on China's offshore gas and oil ELD. Hughes Aerospace given access to China's low-cost satellite launch, $750 million satellite and equipment contract. Farm businesses China's agribusiness officials visited Washington in May 1993 to negotiate massive wheat purchases in 10 states through the National Association of Wheat Growers. GE Chinese Vice Premier Zhou Jiahua promised GE access to energy and other sectors. IBM Chinese Vice Premier Zhou Jiahua visited IBM headquarters and IBM signed MOUs with China's Ministry of Commerce on technological cooperation. McDonnell Douglas Vice Premier Zhou Jiahua visited the McDonnell Douglas facility in California in late April 1994 to thank the company for its support for China's MFN renewal and signed a contract. Various automobile companies. China made $160 million in car purchases from Detroit automakers. Motorola Chinese President Jiang Zemin promised more access to Chinese telecommunication infrastructure. A $120 million RST phase telecommunications plant built by Motorola, a $160 million order from the Big Three automakers, $200 million in oil drilling equipment from companies in Louisiana, Texas, and Washington, $800 million for satellite equipment from Hughes Aerospace, a $1 billion in manufacture switches and other telecommunications equipment from AT&T, a project with Arco Oil and Gas Co. off the southern coast of China to develop a natural gas ELD valued at $1.2 billion, and a projected $4.6 billion in jet orders and purchases options from Boeing Industries over the next several years. AT&T is an illuminating case. The company was the most prominent among the top organizational donors to Democratic and Republican candidates in the 1992 presidential and congressional elections. Although the telecommunications company had no obvious direct stake in U.S.-China trade, China promised it access to China's telecommunication market in 1993. In 1979, when China established formal diplomatic relations with the United States, Beijing invited AT&T to help modernize China's telecommunications network, but the company declined the offer. Throughout the 1980s, China turned to Japanese and European companies to develop its telecommunications infrastructure and, in the early 1990s, it was widely expected that China would open up its telecommunications market. Foreign telecommunications companies already in China would have had an advantage in such an opening, while AT&T would lag behind. AT&T was henceforth anxious to establish a foothold in China. In spring 1993, AT&T executives traveled to China to express their support for the unconditional renewal of China's MFN status. During the trip, they secured a $500 million contract and signed a MOU with China's State Planning Commission. The MOU pledged 10 areas of cooperation between AT&T and China, including technology transfer, joint research and development, training of Chinese nationals, and sales of equipment, network service offering, and management. AT&T China was created in mid-1993 and, in May 1994, AT&T signed an additional agreement specifying a $150 million investment in China in the following 2 years. The then AT&T China CEO William Warwick wrote in 1994 that with potential business in China in the billions, AT&T is fully committed to being in China, with China, for China. AT&T thus led the lobbying efforts for China's MFN unconditional renewal. But after the 1994 Delanking decision, matters deteriorated for AT&T in China. It had been pushed aside by China's state-owned telecommunication giants, which received heavy regulatory and financial support from the Chinese government. Its fortunes in China fell far short of its original expectations as outlined in its 1993-4 MOUs with Beijing. Today, the company's presence in the Chinese telecommunication market is minimal. I will return to this case in the next section. Some of the biggest eventual winners from trade liberalization with China were conspicuously absent in the lobbying efforts during 1993-4. Apple Incorporated and Walmart are two examples. Apple was already ranked 67th in the 1994 Fortune 500 list, and was on the rise to become a nationwide retail giant. However, it was nowhere to be found in the corporate lobbying campaign for China's MFN renewal. Apple was not even among the 307 signatories of the corporate letter supporting Dell'King during the NAL showdown of Congress's debate in August 1994. And it was not among the corporations courted by Beijing. In the early 1990s, such corporations were reluctant to move production to China. As the leading computer maker at the time, Apple was aggressively expanding its manufacturing facilities in California and Colorado. It was not until 1997-8, when the company hired Steve Jobs as president and Tim Cook as vice president of worldwide operation after it suffered a serious setback because of unsatisfactory product launches, that it started to move its assembly lines to China as a cost-cutting and pro-reviving strategy. Apple was not, therefore, active in pushing for U.S.-China trade liberalization in 1993-4. It was opportunistic in that it benefited from liberalization during its profitability crisis only after liberalization had become a reality. Similar examples can be found among some of Walmart's main textile suppliers such as Derby Hosiery, based in Kentucky, which refrained from moving to China during the 1990s and relocated there only after U.S.-China free trade had advanced in full force in the early 2000s. In sum, in the first year of the Clinton administration, Washington's foreign policy elite prioritized trade as a lever to promote human rights in China. The Communist Party, state in China managed to sway U.S. policy by mobilizing some of the most powerful U.S. corporations to become its proxy lobbyists and force the democratic government to put free trade with China ahead of political liberalization. As an ex post justification, the Clinton administration fomented a theory of constructive engagement, according to which free trade with China could empower China's private enterprises and the middle class, which would in turn push for political liberalization. In any event, Beijing successfully invited itself into the US-led global free trade order without compromising on its authoritarian one-party rule. The Dell'King of China's MFN status from human rights consideration was a critical turning point in U.S.-China trade liberalization. Both the United States' embrace of global free trade, as the biggest consumer in the world, and China's integration into the global trading system, as its largest exporter, have grown continuously since the mid-1990s. Clinton's reversal of policy by unconditionally approving China's MFN status paved the way for the administration to grant permanent normal trade relations status to China in 2000. This cleared the last major hurdle to China's accession to the WTO in 2001. By the time the U.S.-China PNTR debate reached Congress in 2000, years of U.S.-China trade liberalization had created a self-sustaining vested interest in Chinese trade in the corporate sector that could spontaneously lobby for further liberalization. The resulting U.S.-China economic symbiosis, as well as U.S. corporate interests, became significant restrainers of the persistent tendency in Washington's diplomatic, military establishment that projects Beijing as a major geopolitical rival. China's WTO accession contributed to the peaking of the China boom and U.S. financial prosperity in the 2000s. With its low-wage regime and skewed income distribution, China consistently manufactured more than it consumed and relied heavily on the global market to absorb its productive capacity. The United States constituted the single most important market for China's exports, and has only recently been surpassed by the European Union. China's export-oriented industry's rapid expansion has made China the biggest exporter, of all Asian exporters, to the United States. Besides the export sector, China's XED asset investment, including infrastructure and housing construction undertaken mostly by the state sector, has been another engine of the China boom. But most of the XED asset investment in the Chinese economy has been financed by bank lending. A large portion of the banking system's liquidity originates from a sterilization process in which exporters surrender their foreign exchange earnings to state banks in exchange for equivalent RMB issued by the People's Bank of China, China's central bank. In other words, the expanding credit that fueled China's investment originates largely from China's trade surplus and the export sector. Therefore, the supposed twin engine of investment and export in China's economic boom is, after all, a single engine of export. The overwhelming majority of China's exports across the world has been invoiced in USD, and the chronic trade surplus enabled China's central bank to rake in an increasing amount of USD to build up its foreign exchange reserve. Following in the footstep of Japan and the four Asian tigers, but on a much larger scale, China invested its foreign reserves in U.S. Treasury bonds, the safest and most liquid USD-denominated assets. This investment helped finance the United States' expanding skull deficit. China's holding of U.S. Treasury bonds has increased with the growth of its foreign reserves since 2001. It became the world's largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasuries in 2008 and, in the decade after the 2008 financial crisis, China's holding of U.S. Treasuries doubled. The U.S. consumer market and Washington's policy of integrating China into the global free trade system enabled the latter's export-driven economic ascendancy. China's low-cost exports fueled a consumption boom in the United States, while China's recycling of its USD earnings in U.S. government bonds helped finance America's expanding skull deficit. It also kept the U.S. interest rate low, fueling the nationalization and finance-led prosperity of the U.S. economy. Niall Ferguson has characterized this economic symbiosis, which Beijing sought and successfully secured at a critical juncture in 1993-4, as a Chimerica formation, as if the two countries had integrated into a single economy. By the end of the Clinton administration, it had become clear that the post-Cold War global order was plagued by frequent regional geopolitical crises in the vacuum created by the Soviet collapse, and by financial crises in the unregulated global free market. The former required increased U.S. military intervention in geopolitical hotspots, and the latter necessitated US-led financial intervention to bail out AFI'd economies and banks. Both generated an ever-increasing skull burden on the American state. U.S. foreign military interventions grew in the 2000s with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Its bailout operations amid increasingly serious and widespread financial crises, culminating in the global financial crisis of 2008, also grew. These interventions pushed the United States further along the path of a costly global empire. China's low-cost manufactured exports and investment in U.S. government debt under the Chimerica formation became an ever more important economic and skull foundation of U.S. empire-making. In the 2000s, China also assisted the United States in containing geopolitical risks in Asia, such as the North Korean nuclear crisis, when America was preoccupied in Central Asia and the Middle East. In the heyday of Chimerica, China became an indispensable helper to the U.S. global empire. 3.1 Party state capitalism vs. U.S. corporations. China's free market reform of the 1990s turned the country into a capitalist economy, in the sense that the imperative of capital accumulation now drives most economic activities. However, China's economic system has not converged with the free market capitalism that the United States envisioned. 3 decades after China's incorporation into the global market, the state maintains control over the economy in the form of state-owned enterprises. Private property rights have not been fully established, leaving the state as the ultimate owner of all land property, with private capitalists having no more than temporary rights to the use of land. China's export boom facilitated the rise of the private sector in China, as small and medium private enterprises, both local and foreign, dominated China's export sector. However, Beijing did not relinquish dominance of state-owned companies in key sectors, including finance, telecommunications, energy, steel, automobile, among others. While many state-owned giants were restructured in the image of U.S. corporations, shedding nearly all of their social functions such as providing housing and health care to employees, many of the largest companies were still controlled by local or central government through direct state ownership or politically motivated state shareholding of public companies. Chinese companies in the global Fortune 500 list grew from 10 in 2000 to 124 in 2020. Of those 124 companies, 91 are SOEs. The dominance of state companies in key sectors is shown in Table 3. It is noteworthy that many large, nominally private companies, like Huawei and Alibaba, remained closely linked to the CCP via party committees in the companies and the company's connection with powerful factions within the CCP. China's state capitalism departs from state capitalism in other countries in that the power of the CCP in the economy goes far beyond SOEs. Some, therefore, conceptualize China's political economy as a unique party-state capitalism. The continuous dominance of the state sector was, to a large extent, founded on the thriving export sector, which has been the source of the Chinese economy's dynamism and profitability. Export enterprises, either foreign or domestic, received various export subsidies such as export credits and tax rebates from the state that boosted their vibrancy. China's central bank had long pegged the RMB to the USD, preventing it from appreciating as fast as export growth for a prolonged period of time. Whether this constitutes a form of potent subsidies to the export sector is a topic of heated debate that I will turn to in section 3.3. The foreign exchange reserves the export sector generated have provided the foundation for the expansion of state bank credit, most of which went to well-connected state enterprises or financial vehicles to support their progress investment and growth. Figures 2 and 3 compare the indebtedness and profitability between state and private companies. They show that state companies have been far more indebted while being much less profitable. Different state sectors became the fiefdoms of different elite factions within the CCP. The division of the state sector between elite families created a balance of power, stabilizing the collective leadership of the party state during the China boom in the 1990s and 2000s. When China's export-led boom faltered during the global financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese government responded by unleashing an aggressive stimulus program that successfully fostered a strong economic recovery driven by debt-financed XED asset investment. The weakening of the export engine and the reckless investment expansion of the state sector financed by state banks during the 2009-10 recovery created a mammoth debt bubble that was no longer matched by the growth in the foreign exchange reserve. Between 2008 and late 2017, outstanding debt in China soared from 148% of GDP to over 250%. The surge of loans during the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic pushed the share to more than 330%. The redundant capacity and infrastructure resulting from the debt-fueled economic rebound have not been profitable. Figure 2 shows that the state sector's indebtedness surged after the stimulus, while Figure 3 shows pro-T-to-asset ratio fell continuously across both private and state sectors after c. 2010. Economic slowdown and surge of liquidity in the form of local currency debt without commensurate expansion of foreign exchange reserves generated pressure for capital flight. It resulted in a stock market meltdown and sharp devaluation of the RMB in 2015-16. The economy only stabilized in 2016 because of tightening capital controls. The banking system often injected rounds of new loans into the economy to prevent it from further slowing. These recurrent and ever larger loan surges further increased indebtedness. The impasse in the Chinese economy is illustrated by the stagnation of its manufacturing expansion, as shown in the Manufacturing Purchasing Manager Index, a lead indicator of manufacturing activities. Ever since the 2009-10 recovery sold out, the PMI has hovered around the stagnation line of FTY. Comparing the new loan data with the PMI, we can see the diminishing effectiveness of loan stimulus. It took ever larger loans to generate the economy's ever smaller rebound after the 2009-10 crisis. China's political economy has developed a debt addiction. Growth slowdown and worsening indebtedness motivated the party, state elite to accelerate their squeeze on the private sector and foreign companies, as well as intensifying inter-party, state elite conflict when the end of high-speed growth threatened the legitimacy of the party, state. Against this backdrop, Xi Jinping, who became the party, state's supreme leader in 2012, launched a series of initiatives to concentrate decision-making power, moving from the party, state's mode of collective leadership governance to autocratic rule. This has accelerated a longer-term institutional centralization of CCP rule since the early 2000s. The centralization process culminated in Xi's successful bid to abolish the 2-year terms limit for state president embedded in the 1982 constitution, effectively making him a lifelong dictator in March 2018. The status turn of the Chinese economy, which started under Hu Jintao before the global financial crisis of 2008, redoubled during the post-crisis slowdown under Xi Jinping. The acceleration of China's status turn under Xi further hardened the U.S. foreign policy elite's view of China. Beijing's assessment of U.S. terminal decline in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis emboldened it to adopt a more confrontational stance across a range of geopolitical issues. In the 2010s, when the United States started to exonerate itself from the wars in the Middle East, Washington turned its attention to countenancing China as a geopolitical rival under Obama's pivot to Asia policy. More importantly, the accelerating status turn of the Chinese economy was at the expense of U.S. corporations' interests in China. This shift is much more significant in turning U.S.-China policy toward a more confrontational mode. In the last section, we saw how Beijing promised access to China's vast market to lure U.S. corporations to become proxy lobbyists and influence U.S.-China policy in its favor. These corporations became keen advocates of Clinton's engagement policy that put human rights issues second to pursuing unconditional free trade with China. U.S. corporations also became a key deterrent to the escalation of particular geopolitical incidents and facilitated quick, reconciliatory resolutions to crises such as the Taiwan missile crisis in 1996, the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and the clash between a U.S. spy plane and a Chinese jet over the South China Sea in 2001. Notable corporate CEOs often played the role of messengers between U.S. and Chinese leaders, becoming unofficial diplomats between the two countries. Powerful American corporations were the glue, stabilizer, and fuel for the Chimerica formation. For many of these corporations, most notably Apple, Walmart, and GM, such efforts paid off, as the expansion of their revenues in China became a key driver of growth. But not all corporations were happy about the China market after making extraordinary efforts to ensure China's low-tariff access to the U.S. market in the early 1990s. For example, AT&T was the leading corporation in the campaign to delink China's MFN status from human rights conditions in 1993-4, as we saw in the last section. At the time, AT&T was enthused by the MOUs it signed with the Chinese government, expecting that Beijing would open up its telecommunications market in return. After the delinking was achieved, and despite its initial signal that it would open up the telecommunications market, Beijing became adamant in protecting domestic state giants like China Telecom. It tightened regulation in 1998 to ban foreign telecommunications companies from using legal loopholes to buy stakes in local providers. By 2000, AT&T's business as a service provider in China was restricted to a 25% stake in a joint venture whose operations were connected to Shanghai. Its minimal presence in China was far from what it had expected in 1993-4. AT&T was not alone. Hughes Aerospace, which was also pivotal in lobbying the Clinton administration on delinking in 1993-4, initially benefited from the Chinese government's offer to launch its commercial satellite into Earth's orbit at half the price of European or US rockets. In 1995, a Chinese rocket exploded during launch, destroying Hughes' satellite. The Chinese launcher refused compensation and requested that Hughes hand over technical data that could improve the reliability of a future launch. Hughes complied and shared the data. However, the transfer of the relevant technology and data was sanctioned by the US government on national security grounds. The technologies and data would benefit China's ballistic missile program, which allegedly would boost China's assistance to the missile programs in Pakistan and Iran. The US government subsequently launched an investigation into Hughes and other US companies that were involved. In 2003, Hughes and the other companies paid $32 million to the US government in a settlement. In the 1990s and 2000s, cases of US corporations' troubled China adventures were exceptions rather than the rule. Most corporations rushing to establish themselves in China saw tremendous gains. But the challenges that AT&T and Hughes confronted, restrictive market access in contrast to what was promised and the pressure to transfer sensitive technology, were precursors of what many other US corporations were to face in China. After the global financial crisis rebound of 2009-10, there were increasing reports of US corporations being squeezed by their Chinese competitors, which were often aided by government regulators and subsidized by low-cost loans from state banks. Complaints mounted that the Chinese government pressured US corporations, subtly or explicitly, to transfer their technology to their Chinese joint venture partners, who then became their competitors by selling similar services or products at much lower prices. The anti-monopoly law implemented in 2008 and the cybersecurity law passed in 2016 were increasingly and disproportionately used against foreign companies, jeopardizing US corporations' market access, intellectual property rights, and sensitive customer data in China. The American Chamber of Commerce in China conducts an annual survey among its members to gauge the business climate for US enterprises. Since 2010, a growing number of American businesses have found China increasingly unwelcome. In 2018, only 20% said they felt more welcome than before. Among the challenges American businesses say they are facing in China, Chinese authorities' unfair treatment has been cited as a persistent problem. The most frequently mentioned areas in which US corporations feel unfairly treated in comparison to their Chinese competitors are market access and enforcement of government regulations. In the 2018 survey, half of the US companies in China expressed concerns that inadequate intellectual property protection limited their investment in China, in comparison with 20 to 30% that indicated that such concerns had no effect at all. Amid a deteriorating business environment, US companies choosing not to expand, or to expand by less than 10% over the last year, rose from 58% in 2009 to 73% in 2019. In contrast, the percentage of US companies that expanded by more than 20% over the last year fell from 33% to 13% over the same period. US corporations that had relocated or considered relocating capacity outside China jumped from 11% in 2013, when the question was asked in the survey, to 25% in 2016, and has stayed at around 20% since. The U.S. China Business Council, a lobbying group that played a significant role in bringing fast and deep U.S.-China economic integration in the 1990s, published a report in 2017 based on a survey of its member companies that showed the same grievances about China. Of the companies surveyed, 48% expressed less optimism about the business climate than 3 years previously, and 57% complained the Chinese authorities did not live up to their promise of reform and improvement of the business environment. The companies complained about the Chinese government's bias toward domestic companies and voiced concerns about intellectual property protection in China. 19% said they had been directly asked to transfer technology to Chinese companies. The dampened enthusiasm of U.S. corporations for China is reflected in the general fall in China exposure among the biggest corporations in the United States. I constructed a database that uses the number of mentions of China in the annual 10K report that the top 10 Fortune 500 companies led to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to indicate these companies' exposure in China either through sales or investment. As shown in Figure 5, the top 10 companies' exposure to China dropped precipitously from about 2014, following rapid growth in earlier periods. For example, GM's mention of China in its report stayed in single digits from 2004. It grew to the teens in 2005 and then increased steadily to 60 to 70 mentions in 2014, where it stayed. There is also an apparent rise in companies in the top 10 with little China exposure, replacing those with significant China exposure. Examples include providers of healthcare and health insurance like United Health Group and CVS Health. These two trends have combined to generate a fall in China exposure among the top 10 companies. If we expand the list to the top 30 companies, we see that American companies' exposure to China stopped growing after around 2010. All this suggests that while China has been at the frontier of Pro-T when the United States' largest corporations expanded rapidly in the RST decade after China's accession to the WTO, this expansion simply ceased or even reversed after 2010. 3.2 U.S. corporate lawsuits against Chinese entities. While the increasing pressure that U.S. corporations faced in the Chinese market led to the dampening of corporate expansion in China in general, some U.S. corporations caught up in a dispute with their Chinese partners and competitors, or allegedly receiving biased treatment from the Chinese authorities, increasingly resort to legal action in an attempt to redress the problem. Conflict over the loss of U.S. companies' intellectual property to their Chinese partners, competitors, or the Chinese state has been the main source of U.S. corporate lawsuits against Chinese entities. A central goal of Beijing's statist economic policy was to leapfrog China's technological upgrading at the expense of the United States. This ambition was fully revealed in the Made in China 2025 initiative in 2015. Although the number of patents registered in China has risen rapidly over the last decade, more nuanced analysis shows that many of those patents were worthless from a commercial standpoint. In fact, more than 90% of China-registered patents were not renewed after VE years. This lack of commercially viable innovation, despite vast government resources for this purpose and the sheer number of patents, illustrates the limit of China's progress in indigenous innovation, particularly in the dominant state sector dubbed the paper tigers of innovation. The lack of protection of intellectual property rights stands in the way of local innovation. The inadequate progress in China's state-led innovation manifests in China's lack of technological self-sufficiency. When Chinese manufactured products move up the technological ladder, China's dependence on foreign technology increases. The intellectual property balance of payment in Figure 6 shows that China is still largely an intellectual property deficit country, meaning it pays a lot more for foreign patents and copyrights than foreign entities pay for Chinese ones. Moreover, this deficit has been expanding. Given the limits of its homegrown innovation system, the state's drive to attain technological self-sufficiency hinges on controversial and at times illegal appropriation of technology from foreign companies, including outright economic espionage. The result is a rising number of lawsuits initiated by U.S. corporations against Chinese entities over intellectual property rights. These often involve some of the most prominent U.S. companies. For example, DuPont Chemicals was one of the pioneers that, in 2004, started a joint venture with a Chinese company to use its new technology to turn corn into textile materials. In 2006, it licensed the technology to Zhangjiagang Glory Chemical Industry Company in China, but from about 2013 it suspected its Chinese partners were using its technology to produce the same products at much lower prices. When DuPont started to take legal action against its Chinese partners, it received a warning from the Chinese authorities, pressuring it to drop the case. In December 2017, Chinese anti-monopoly investigators appeared in DuPont Shanghai of CES, demanding passwords to the company's worldwide research networks. Investigators printed documents, seized computers, and intimidated employees, even accompanying some when they went to the bathroom. Fearing for its business prospects in China, DuPont eventually withdrew its case. Motorola, another leading company that moved to China as early as the mid-1990s, had a similar experience. In 2010, Motorola sued Huawei Technologies for stealing its wireless network technology. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce put pressure on Motorola by initiating an anti-monopoly investigation. Ultimately, Motorola dropped the lawsuit and, in 2011, it sold its wireless business to China's Lenovo Group. As the Chinese courts have been controlled by the party, state and U.S. companies may have considered the courts to be biased toward the Chinese defendants. Many of these lawsuits were led in U.S. courts against Chinese entities that have businesses in the United States. For example, American Superconductor, a Massachusetts high-tech firm that manufactured essential high-tech components and software drivers for wind turbines, was a rising star in green technology and openly praised by President Obama. Its business expanded rapidly when one of its customers, Sinovel, a Chinese state-owned wind turbine company connected to the family of Wenjiabao, began to receive generous state support to ramp up its wind turbine production for Chinese as well as international markets. Sinovel's order constituted 3/4 of AMSC's business. However, in 2011 Sinovel suddenly refused to accept and pay for a shipment from AMSC without giving a clear reason. Losing its biggest customer, AMSC's stock price plummeted and the company nearly went bankrupt. After a lengthy investigation, AMSC found out that Sinovel had bribed an employee in AMSC's European of CE to download its product source codes. The Austrian court found the employee guilty and imprisoned him. AMSC then sued Sinovel, seeking compensation for its economic loss in a U.S. court. In 2018, the court found Sinovel guilty of theft of trade secrets and ordered it to pay more than $59 million in compensation. In a media interview, the AMSC CEO expressed indignation that the legal victory was not enough to make up for the loss that AMSC suffered. The AMSC CEO, having severed all its business ties with China, spoke frankly about the risk that all U.S. businesses face in China. The rules are set up in a way that the local brands will win. Participation in the Chinese market is for Chinese companies only. Your participation as a Western company, at least to date, is a mirage. They're there to bring you in, be able to go away to harvest whatever they can from you, and then spit you out when you're no longer useful. Not all U.S. companies' litigation against Chinese companies in U.S. courts end well like it did for AMSC. Most of the U.S. companies involved have operations in China, and the Chinese companies litigated against could countersue in a Chinese court as revenge. One such case is Vico Instruments Incorporated, which produced advanced machinery for the production of LED chips and supplied the booming chip industry in China. Around 2012, Vico found out that its main Chinese competitors, AMEC of Shanghai, obtained its technology and produced a much cheaper version of its products. Vico sued AMEC in a U.S. court. In 2017, the court found in favor of Vico and blocked AMEC from purchasing critical components from the United States for making the machines. In response, AMEC led a lawsuit against Vico for patent infringement in a Chinese court in Fujian, where Vico maintained a production facility. The Chinese court agreed with AMEC and did not even notify Vico of the hearing. Just 1 month after the U.S. court ruled in Vico's favor, the Fujian court ruled in favor of AMEC and blocked Vico from selling its machines in China. Being shut out from the Chinese market would spell financial disaster for Vico, and it narrowly resorted to a private settlement with AMEC outside the court. The lawsuits by AMSC and Vico are by no means isolated cases. Figure 7 shows that the aggregate number of lawsuits led by U.S. companies against Chinese entities related to intellectual property right in U.S. courts rose steadily in the early 2000s, then jumped after 2009 in the aftermath of the global financial crisis and subsequent Chinese stimulus. The majority of these cases follows a typical pattern. They involve U.S. companies, with or without businesses in China, whose employees are bribed or manipulated to appropriate essential trade secrets and hand them over to Chinese competitors, who then sell similar products at much lower prices and take the original company's market share in China and elsewhere in the world. The relation between the employee who appropriates the trade secret and the Chinese competitor that obtains the technology varies from case to case. In some cases, the employee, after obtaining the trade secret, reaches out to the Chinese competitor of the victim company to offer the trade secret for a price. In other cases, the employees form new companies in China to produce the same products and purposely approach the customers of the victim companies to offer cheaper alternative products. There are cases in which the employees appropriating the trade secret were spies deliberately sent from Chinese companies or even the Chinese government to target particular technologies owned by certain companies. In one case, the U.S. company's employee responsible for the trade secret appropriation had been recruited by high-level officials of the Chinese State Council to target a specific key technology owned by DuPont. The employee acted under directives from Beijing for more than a decade. In the end, the FBI became involved in the case, and in 2014 the indicted employee was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for economic espionage. Not all victims of intellectual property appropriation choose legal action. There are cases in which U.S. companies, aware of the size of the Chinese market and thus wanting to avoid animosity with the Chinese authorities, choose to adapt rather than GHT the infringement of their intellectual property rights. For example, Vermeer, a manufacturer of heavy agricultural and industrial equipment, has been exporting motorized drilling machines and other heavy machinery to China since the 1990s. In the 2000s, it found that XCMG, a local state company in Suzhou, was selling copycat machines at much lower prices. Vermeer did not take any action but learned to innovate fast enough to stay ahead of the Chinese copycat. It also adapted by no longer selling the most advanced machine in the Chinese market. Instead, it sold more simply lower-cost versions of its machines in China. XCMG, as well as other heavy machinery manufacturers in China such as Sany and Zoomlion, has reportedly been thriving on selling products that are strikingly similar to designs by Vermeer and other leading construction and mining machine makers like Caterpillar and Liebherr. Many of these manufacturers have not taken legal action, seemingly for the sake of the continuous goodwill they rely on in China. Some U.S. corporations have tried to deal with the intensifying and allegedly unfair competition from Chinese companies by acquiring Chinese competitors. However, the Chinese authorities often step in to forestall such attempts. The state's goal is to cultivate state-owned champions to outcompete foreign companies and not to let them fall into foreign companies' hands. For example, in 2005 Carlyle Group in the United States attempted to acquire XCMG and Beijing became aware of this attempt. In an effort to prevent foreign companies from monopolizing the construction machine manufacturing business, the Chinese government intervened to end a buyer to outcompete Carlyle's offer. Eventually, XCMG became a central government-controlled state enterprise. The state's shortcut to technological upgrading not only brings about economic espionage on the part of individuals, but also governmental coercion of foreign companies. Since 2010, allegations that the Chinese government has forced U.S. companies in China to hand over their trade secrets to Chinese competitors as a precondition for continuous market access have soared. This open governmental pressure has forced U.S. corporations to go beyond individualized legal means and coalesce into corporate collective action to influence the U.S. state, urging it to press Beijing for systemic improvements in the business environment. 3.3 From Beijing's proxy lobbyists to anti-China corporate insurgency. In the last section I showed that in the debate about U.S.-China free trade in the early 1990s, organized labor and manufacturers that were initially reluctant to offshore constituted a coalition against unconditional renewal of China's MFN status. Ultimately, this coalition lost the battle to the coalition of Hainan's and Yanchel corporations incentivized by Beijing's promises. After its defeat in 1994, the anti-China trade coalition lost energy when the disempowerment of labor unions in U.S. politics accelerated and the initially reluctant manufacturers eventually offshored to China. Following China's accession to the WTO in 2001, the China shock to the U.S. economy was immediate and vast. Between 1999 and 2001, the influx of Chinese imports accounted for the loss of more than 2 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. This shock revitalized the anti-China trade coalition in the 2000s. In less than 20 years after China's accession to the WTO, a lobbying coalition advocating designation of China as a currency manipulator emerged. The designation of a trade partner as currency manipulator was enabled by a 1988 U.S. law. A country's currency value against the USD is supposed to rise alongside its export increases to the United States. If a country's central bank intervenes to stem the appreciation of its currency, the undervalued currency would give its export sector protracted price competitiveness. Such central bank intervention is regarded as a non-market, unfair subsidy to the export sector at the expense of U.S. manufacturers' market share and manufacturing jobs. In these circumstances, the law allows the U.S. government to adopt remedial actions including placing extra duties on imports from that country or using government procurement rules to shun such imports. The purpose of the new anti-China trade coalition is to lobby Congress and the White House to designate China as a currency manipulator and adopt remedial measures to stem the influx of Chinese imports. The backbone of this coalition is organized labor. U.S. manufacturers who turned out to be less capable of offshoring to China and are seeing their home market eroded by Chinese imports have joined the coalition as another formidable force. Most of these are from the steel industry, but they also include manufacturers of petrochemical products and precision equipment. Several umbrella organizations involved, or formed, to lobby Washington on the issue include the China Currency Coalition, the Alliance for American Manufacturing, the American Iron and Steel Institute, the Coalition for a Prosperous America, the Committee to Support U.S. Trade Laws, and the Fair Currency Coalition. For the coalition's influence in Washington grew when unemployment brought about by manufacturing job losses attributable to China trade increased in the 2000s. It gained key allies among Congress members from the hard-hit areas, such as those from Midwestern Rust Belt represented by the Congressional Steel Caucus. These areas have also become key battlegrounds in presidential elections. While the China currency manipulation accusation climbed up the political agenda in Washington, thanks to the efforts of the coalition, it stopped short of succeeding in making the administration designate China as a currency manipulator and adopt the requested remedies, except for a brief moment of such designation in August 2019 to January 2020 under the Trump administration. One reason for its lack of success is that these lobbying efforts had been countered by a countervailing lobbying coalition constituted by U.S. corporations that have benefited from manufacturing outsourcing to China, and hence a low China currency. Such powerful counter-lobbyists include Walmart, Eastman Kodak, Caterpillar, Footwear Distributors and Retailers of America, National Retail. For example, see Inside U.S. Trade Federation, American Electronic Association, the U.S., China Business Council, and some Wall Street banks. 5. They pointed out that the RMB has appreciated orderly since 2005, an appreciation that was regarded by the anti-China trade coalition as too little too late. U.S. corporations had been split on the question of China's currency manipulation and tariffs on Chinese imports in the 2000s. In the 2010s, more widespread reservation or even hostility toward China emerged among U.S. corporations over the issues of intellectual property rights and market access. Whereas lobbying against China's alleged currency manipulation was initiated by corporations which could not outsource to China and resisted by corporations with a significant presence in China, the lobbying efforts concerning intellectual property rights protection and market access in China were spearheaded by U.S. corporations with a significant presence in China. For fear of retaliation by the Chinese government, many companies did not openly criticize the Chinese government's policy on technology transfer and market access. Instead, they clandestinely fed the U.S. government information about their misgivings and lobbied Washington to take action on their behalf. Some, however, did make their actions more public. For example, Micron Technology, a California-based memory chip manufacturer, led a lawsuit in California against its Chinese competitor Jinhua, accusing it of masterminding a theft of its technology. After Jinhua countersued Micron in a Chinese court with the backing of the party, state and won, Micron leaned on its political connections to convince the U.S. Department of Commerce that Jinhua's theft of its technology constituted a national security threat. In 2018, the Department of Commerce decided to backlist Jinhua and barred it from obtaining U.S. technology and components, effectively bringing down the company. Besides technology transfer, restrictive market access constitutes another major issue where U.S. corporations try to pressure Washington for assistance. Some U.S. corporations started to complain, as early as 2004, that the Chinese government had not opened the Chinese market to them as widely as promised following China's accession to the WTO. Despite the subtle pressure exercised by the Bush and Obama administrations through behind-closed-door negotiations and WTO lawsuits, many practices and regulations that favored Chinese enterprises in their competition with foreign enterprises, such as uneven investigation and enforcement of anti-monopoly laws targeting foreign companies, continued to worsen after 2010. On January 19, 2011, when Obama held a joint press conference with Hu Jintao at the White House at the end of Hu's state visit, the American president publicly raised the issue of unfair treatment of U.S. corporations by Chinese authorities, albeit in diplomatic politeness, for the first time. I did also stress to President Hu that there has to be a level playing field for American companies competing in China, that trade has to be fair. So I welcomed his commitment that American companies will not be discriminated against when they compete for Chinese government procurement contracts. And I appreciate his willingness to take new steps to combat the theft of intellectual property. Besides pressuring the White House, U.S. corporations have also been active in lobbying Congress and urging it to take action against restrictive market access and intellectual property appropriation in China. As shown in Figure 8, business lobbying on the two issues rose steadily after 2004, peaked in 2010, and stayed at a high level thereafter. While the lobbying activities surrounding currency manipulation show a split between U.S. corporations, those concerning market access and intellectual property rights in China demonstrate a consensus among U.S. corporations across different sectors. The list of corporations and organizations involved in lobbying Congress over these issues in 2019, a peak year for such efforts, manifests a broad spectrum, including Oracle, IMB, Google, GM, Eli Lilly, National Chicken Council, Playboy, Morgan Stanley, United Steelworkers, and Conservatives for Property Rights. Ultimately, the issues of market access, intellectual property rights, and even currency manipulation are all interrelated and can be seen as a manifestation of Beijing's general hostility toward U.S. and other foreign companies. As early as January 2010, 19 business lobbying groups including the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce wrote to the White House to complain about systematic efforts by China to develop policies that build their domestic enterprises at the expense of U.S. firms and U.S. intellectual property that pose an immediate danger to U.S. companies, urging stronger action by Washington against China. In 2017, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Chamber of Commerce in China published a blueprint for action, addressing priority issues of concern in U.S. China commercial relations. This was a list of demands for the new U.S. administration regarding what it had to do to pressure Beijing to improve the business environment in China for U.S. corporations. Its introduction succinctly summarizes the across-the-board grievances of U.S. corporations. Over the past several years, the business environment in China has deteriorated for many U.S. and other foreign companies. This trend impacts companies not only operating in the country, but also exporting into China and competing with Chinese companies in third-country markets. It is essential that our future trade and investment strategy with China emphasize the need for competitive markets in China, not merely defending our markets from subsidized steel and other commodities. The substantial, growing, and harmful distortions of China industrial policies on the US and global economies will be far more damaging if China effectively eliminates foreign competition in its home market in critical areas ranging from electric vehicles to aviation to semiconductors. Besides lobbying for China's designation as a currency manipulator, major labor organizations, including the AFL-CIO and the United Steelworkers, also earnestly lobby for pushback against China's policy of market access and technology transfer, asserting the Chinese government cannot continue to violate international norms with respect to subsidies, investment, worker rights, and trade policy, at the expense of American workers and producers. Remarkably, some corporations that used to lobby on behalf of China's interests shifted their dispositions to lobbying for legislation against China. One notable example is Caterpillar, one of the key firms lobbying for China's MFN status in the 1990s, when it started to establish itself in the Chinese market. In the early 2000s, it dominated China's construction machinery market. With the support of the financial stimulus of 2009-10, however, Chinese construction machine manufacturers expanded aggressively. China-made excavators' market share shot from 26% in 2009 to 62% in 2019, at the expense of Caterpillar's products, as well as European and Japanese machines. Before 2010, Caterpillar openly lobbied against the congressional bills that accused China of currency manipulation and approved U.S. retaliatory tariffs on Chinese exports. After 2010, the company reversed its position. A stronger Chinese currency would benefit the company by boosting its exports to China while defending its US and other non-China markets from its Chinese competitors, which offer a product lineup that suspiciously resembles Caterpillar design. A lobbyist for Caterpillar has noted that getting China to change its monetary policy is a huge issue, and the US, from the government to businesses, is lobbying China to fix what they see as a major inequality that affects trade. THIRD-WORLDISM anti-China corporate insurgency was the force behind the Obama administration's redoubled effort to push for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The idea of the TPP was to establish a free trade zone, including the United States and most Asia-Pacific countries, except China. The TPP emphasized protecting intellectual property rights, guaranteeing market access, and restricting state-owned enterprises that are in competition with private ones. These are the issues that U.S. corporations complain about most in China. The TPP, if realized, was expected to put pressure on China to improve its intellectual property protection and market access, as well as reduce government support for state-owned enterprises, all conditions for China to join the TPP. Such an anti-China corporate insurgency also supported Trump's tougher stance on China trade, and it underlines the continuation, and even hardening, of this tough stance into the Biden administration. 3.4 Business lobby and geopolitical pivot. At the height of Chimerica, U.S. corporations that enjoyed actual and expected benefits from the Chinese market have been China's lobbyists by proxy. They not only lobbied for policies favorable to Chinese interests, but also lobbied against any policy that would hurt Chinese interests. As a senior lobbyist in one of Washington's most coveted lobbying firms remarked, the business community has always been the tip of the spear in terms of keeping the U.S.-China relationship on a good track. In 2013, the U.S. Navy began regular freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, sailing warships through waters crucial to global shipping but claimed by China as its maritime territories. Standoffs and confrontation between the U.S. and Chinese navies became the new normal. Once the national security hawks were unchecked and could dominate policy making, Washington became more prone to adopt policy driven by the imperatives of geopolitical competition with China, even if it risked hurting the interests of particular U.S. corporations. One of the most notable examples is the change in U.S. policy toward Huawei, a Chinese private tech giant believed to have a close connection with the Chinese military and security apparatus. When Huawei climbed up the value chain and emerged as a global player in high-tech telecommunications, it established mutually beneficial relations with U.S. tech companies. As a manufacturer of consumer telecom equipment and telecom infrastructure systems, Huawei relied on high-end computer chips and advanced components manufactured by U.S. companies or high-tech firms in countries closely allied with the U.S., like Taiwan and South Korea, whose products rely on US licensed technology. As a rising global giant tightly integrated with the US-dominated high-tech supply chain, Huawei did not compete with most U.S. firms, and instead became a major customer of U.S. tech firms. When national security officials and Congress started to question Huawei's connection to the Chinese military and the cybersecurity risk arising from the telecom system it built in the U.S. and allied countries, Washington initially downplayed those considerations. Indeed, it continued to support Huawei's expansion into the United States. The Bush administration was supportive of Huawei's entrance into the U.S. market. It attempted to weaken the review power of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States over Huawei to facilitate a merger of Huawei with a U.S. company. In 2010, a former national security official from the Bush administration joined Huawei to advise on its business growth into the U.S. market. This U.S.-China tech cooperation continued into the early Obama years before taking a sharp turn. In 2012, the White House and the House of Representatives reviewed the potential security risks posed by Huawei, leading Washington to bar U.S. government of CES from procuring from Huawei in 2013. In 2014, the National Security Agency launched an investigation into Huawei, which evoked a strong reaction by the Chinese government. Thus, a shift was underway in the early 2010s, when Washington turned from supporting cooperation with Huawei to forestalling it. It later evolved into a policy of pressuring U.S. allies to ban Huawei from their telecommunication infrastructure and banning the export of US-made computer chips or computer chips carrying U.S. technologies from around the world to Huawei. This aggressive policy against Huawei was devised by the Trump administration and it obtained bipartisan support in Congress. When the Trump White House attempted to ease its ban on selling equipment and components to Huawei in 2019 in anticipation of the beginning of U.S.-China trade talks, and Beijing's concession in the talks, it provoked an immediate bipartisan pushback from Congress. This aggressive policy was solely based on national security considerations. The fact that the policy could advance and take hold despite its damage to the interests of many American high-tech firms, which sold equipment, components, and technology to fuel Huawei's global expansion, showcases how much the structural conditions of U.S.-China relations have changed. The weakening of U.S. corporate support for amicable U.S.-China relations, as well as the receding of efforts to restrain the foreign policy elite, which prefers to position China as a U.S. rival, came at a time when the popular backlash against globalization in general, and trade with China in particular, had reached a new height. Since the advent of neoliberal globalization and the opening of U.S.-China free trade, organized labor and their political representatives have adamantly resisted these developments. Having experienced massive manufacturing offshoring and unemployment, as predicted by the critics of globalization in the early 1990s, downwardly mobile workers became a potent voting bloc that propelled anti-trade politicians, from Bernie Sanders on the left to Donald Trump on the right, to prominence in the 2016 presidential election. Both Trump and Sanders saw unfettered free trade with China as a mistake. After Trump became president, he launched a trade war with China by leveling high tariffs against a wide range of Chinese products. The reservations about and even hostility toward China trade became so mainstream in Washington that even the new Biden administration pledged not to withdraw Trump's China tariffs and to continue pursuing a confrontational policy toward China. 4 spheres of influence. 4.1 China's rise as a capital exporter. As we saw in the last section, China's stimulus program in response to the 2008 global financial crisis successfully led to a rebound of the Chinese economy in 2009-10. However, the stimulus also led to an overaccumulation crisis characterized by rising indebtedness, excess capacity, and falling protests for Chinese enterprises. Under the weight of these problems, economic growth slowed after 2010, and this slowdown prompted the Chinese state to expand its control over the economy and redouble its squeeze on private and foreign enterprises. Another remedy for the toughening business environment in the domestic economy was the surge of capital exports in the form of FDI and external lending, as shown in Figure 9. Although the amount of outward FDI far exceeds external loans, more than 70% of China's outward FDI, both in stock and out, is directed to offshore financial centers including Hong Kong and Caribbean tax havens, and mostly ends up in holding companies and real estate in these centers, indicating that most of this investment is capital flight. In the case of Africa, where Chinese FDI data are least distorted by capital flight, loans always prevail over FDI as the main form of capital export. Based on data in Africa, we could project that, discounting capital flight, China's foreign aid, mostly as loans offered by China's official financial institutions, has become the predominant form of its capital export to the developing world. Chinese external lending, on the aggregate level, has become comparable to direct lending by the United States and the World Bank. In the 2000s, amid the global commodity boom, many of China's loans to other developing countries allowed it to lock in raw materials from those countries. Many loans were made to energy or raw material exporting countries and repaid with specified amounts of commodities. The best known example of this type of loan is China's $63 billion to Venezuela in 2007-14, to be repaid with oil deliveries. After 2010, more loans went to Nan's infrastructure projects that paved the way for the export of China's overcapacity in infrastructure construction. Much of this capital export was put under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative from 2013. For Chinese-funded BRI projects, 89% of the project's contractors were Chinese companies using Chinese materials, 7.6% were local companies, and 3.4% were non-Chinese foreign companies. In contrast, for projects funded by traditional multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, 29% of contractors were Chinese, 40.8% were local, and 30.2% were foreign. This barrage of Chinese capital export to the developing world created new demands for Chinese enterprises struggling with overcapacity. For example, according to Chinese customs data, Chinese steel exports rose for more than 20 times between 2001 and a peak in 2015. Foreign sales created a lifeline for the many steel mills which expanded aggressively during the stimulus of 2009-10 and have been undermined by overcapacity and heavy debt ever since. Another sector plagued by excess capacity is construction machine manufacturing. Major construction machine manufacturers' capacity and revenue soared under the stimulus of 2009-10. But, as Figure 11 shows, the annual revenue change of the three major construction machine manufacturers in China plunged from a peak of robust growth in 2009-10 to contraction afterward, when the stimulus-induced rebound of the Chinese economy tapered off, and only started to grow again after 2013 with the beginning of the BRI initiative. These companies' annual reports indicate the importance of orders from overseas Belt and Road projects, financed by Chinese lending, to their revenue growth compared with the stagnant domestic market. As shown in the last section, state capitalism has increasingly protected domestic Chinese companies at the expense of US and other foreign companies in China's home market. China's capital export under the BRI created a Chinese sphere of influence in which Chinese goods and firms enjoyed privileged access vis-a-vis local firms and other foreign firms. In the last section, we saw that US corporations like construction machine makers have been losing market share in China to their state-supported Chinese competitors. But China's expanding influence in the developing world means that American corporations lose market there, too. Over the past decade, the global market share of Chinese construction machine manufacturers climbed rapidly at the expense of those in the United States. In 2020, China's Sany replaced Caterpillar for the RST time as the top excavator seller in the world. Among the top 10 construction machine manufacturers in the world, US companies had a combined market share of 17.7%, whereas Chinese companies' combined market share is 20.3%. It is not surprising, therefore, that US companies resorted to lobbying Washington for a policy that could enhance their competitiveness vis-a-vis their Chinese counterparts in the developing world. Caterpillar, for example, lobbied the Obama administration in 2011 for a free trade agreement with Colombia, explicitly stating the agreement was essential to boost its sales in the country and keep its Chinese competitors at bay. The 2017 action plan that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and AmCham China presented to the Trump administration explicitly protested that Chinese companies were exploiting the advantages they gained from U.S. companies, through technology transfer, for example, to compete with U.S. companies in the third country market. A 2021 Council on Foreign Relations BRI task force, constituted of scholars and U.S. business representatives, concludes that BRI creates unfair advantages for Chinese companies, leaving U.S. and other foreign companies unable to compete in a number of BRI countries. Companies squeezed out by Chinese competitors in BRI countries named in the report include electronic payment companies like PayPal, construction contractors and engineering firms, and railroad equipment manufacturers in countries that are U.S. allies, such as Germany and Japan. Thus, intercapitalist competition between U.S. and Chinese corporations is not net to China's domestic market, the competition has gone global. 4.2 New dependency in the global south. While China's capital export to other developing economies is to serve the need of its domestic political economy, the impact of China's inroads into other developing economies varies. Although China offers opportunities to developing countries as a new, expanding market for commodities exports and as a source of capital, it also becomes a source of dependence for many developing countries. Industrialization through reduced reliance on commodity exports has been a long-standing priority of many governments pursuing independent development. Developing countries have attempted to achieve this through import substitution or export-oriented industrialization. The rise of China has disrupted such endeavors in many developing countries. Soaring Chinese demand for oil, raw materials, agricultural products, and many other commodities drove up global commodity prices and boosted the proteas of commodity exporters. And increased earnings in commodity exporting countries led to the expansion of extractive industries and agribusiness, neutralizing development policies designed to reduce the share of commodity exports in their economies. For example, the amount of land used for soybean cultivation in Brazil doubled between 1990 and 2005. This entailed the expansion of farmland deep into the environmentally sensitive Amazon frontier. This vast expansion was largely driven by China's demand, which constituted 42.7% of Brazil's soybean exports in the early 2000s. The share shot up to 80% in 2018 amid the U.S.-China trade war that drove more Chinese importers to turn to Brazil. In Argentina, Chinese companies dominated both ends of the soybean commodity chain, skewing the economy's distribution of income even more than is usually the case when integrated commodity chains serve markets in developed countries. The copper mining industries in Chile and other Latin American countries also expanded significantly during the same period. Exports of copper from Latin America increased by 237.5% between 2000 and 2006. Most of this increased production went to China. In 2016, 67% of Chile's copper exports and 73% of Peru's exports were to China. Much of the same phenomenon occurred in Africa, where countries rich in metal ores, such as Zambia, saw the boom of their extractive sectors, with China becoming their main market, though China's recent slowdown hit their raw materials exports. Although China helps boost raw material sectors, its efficient, low-cost industries put increasing pressure on manufacturing sectors across the developing world. Some argue that the genesis of China's export-oriented manufacturing in the 1990s, particularly after the one-off devaluation in 1994 of China's currency to boost exports, is responsible for the economic troubles of other Asian exporters like Malaysia and Thailand, and that it paved the way for the Asian financial crisis of 1997-8. Chinese manufactured exports created similar pressure on Latin American industries, especially in Mexico. The combined effect of expanding raw material export sectors and increasing competitive pressures on domestic industries resulting from the China boom created conditions for deindustrialization and the return of dependence on exports of natural resources in the developing world. Whether or how much this change will damage or benefit the long-term developmental prospects of individual developing countries, and whether it will bring about the so-called resource curse, depends on each country's internal political economy. The mining sector in many Latin American countries is dominated by state companies or heavily regulated by the government, allowing these countries to have some leverage over pricing and output in their negotiations with China and also enabling them to put mining proteas into more productive investments. In contrast, most African countries lack competitive homegrown mining corporations and rely on foreign companies to extract their resources. In many cases, Chinese state companies, often in tacit partnership with other transnational mining corporations, own and run the entire commodity chain from mining sites to the ports that ship the raw materials. African governments are in a much less favorable position to negotiate with their Chinese partners, and the latter can concentrate on maximizing short-term gains without considering the long-term impact on the local economy, society, and environment. The 2009-10 stimulus in China led to a domestic infrastructure construction boom. This created a surge in global demand for commodities that benefited commodity exporters across the developing world. Demand from China was the main reason many of these exporters, from Brazil to Zambia, were spared from the worst effects of the global financial crisis in 2008. When China's construction boom sold out after 2010, its demand for commodities fell and many commodity exporters, buoyed by the China boom, experienced a slowdown or even recession. The economic crises in Brazil and Venezuela in the 2010s are cases in point. Simultaneously, the Chinese economy started to be plagued by overcapacity and an economic slowdown, as we saw in the previous section. In this context, making developmental loans to other developing countries to finance infrastructure projects, which then hired Chinese contractors and procured Chinese materials, became an increasingly significant form of China's capital export. A country's increasing indebtedness to China usually brings a large trade deficit. One example is Pakistan, which, according to World Bank data, borrowed heavily from China after 2010 to fund the port and road projects linked to the China-Pakistan economic corridor and owned the largest stock of Chinese official loans as of 2019. Corresponding to the surge in Chinese loans was Pakistan's rising imports of machinery and construction materials from China. Pakistan's trade deficit with China soared. In 2018, Pakistan plunged into a balance of payments and currency crisis that pushed the government to seek an emergency loan from the IMF. Many attributed the crisis to Pakistan's deep involvement in the debt-driven CPEC with China. Besides the trade deficit resulting from Chinese loans, the sustainability of the debt-driven infrastructure boom is another concern. China's infrastructure lending to the developing world is an externalization of its domestic stimulus program in 2009-10, when Chinese state banks opened the floodgates of loans to fund local governments and state enterprises so they could pursue XED asset investment. As most of these investments fed industrial overcapacity and were not going to be pro-table, the loans were unsustainable and led to a debt time bomb among local governments and state enterprises. While the Chinese government could contain the domestic debt crisis by bailing out state sector debtors on the verge of defaulting through loan rollovers, write-off, or skull injections, this remedy is infeasible for China's external debtors in the developing world. In light of the default risk, many Chinese external loans contained conditions about collaterals, allowing China to seize control of strategic facilities in case of default. For example, the Sri Lankan government started to borrow from China and hire Chinese contractors to build a new port in the strategic coastal city of Hambantota, which oversees a busy shipping lane in the Indian Ocean. The port continuously lost money after it opened in 2010. The Sri Lankan government eventually defaulted on the loan and let the Chinese state-owned operator seize control of the port on a 99-year lease in 2017. It is still too early to know whether the case of Hambantota is an exception or the rule, but it has already raised alarm and invoked debate about whether the Chinese loans were set up in a way that would make repayment difficult, if not impossible, and whether Beijing's real intention was to create dependency on Chinese nans and seize control of strategic facilities across the developing world using its loans. As many of those strategic facilities would be located at geopolitical choke points, some speculate that they would eventually become springboards for China's projection of military power far from home. This leads us to ponder the geopolitical implications of China's capital exports, which are turning China into a new imperial power. 4.3 Late imperialism and its discontents. When China's economic power in Asia and beyond increases, Beijing will naturally try to leverage its economic clout to increase its geopolitical influence. The way Beijing acts vis-a-vis its Asian neighbors could be a harbinger of how it will interact with other regions. China's imperial turn, as the projection of a state's formal or informal political power beyond its sovereign border, is hardly surprising. China's economic rise and the end of the Cold War made it possible to pursue a new Sino-centric order with incumbent governments in Asia that resemble the pre-modern Sino-centric order. As both rich and poor Asian countries become more integrated with the Sino-centric production network and grow dependent on Chinese investment and loans, many already see that Beijing has been using threats to curtail economic ties as a diplomatic weapon. For example, China is rarely hesitant to use or threaten to use economic leverage to reinforce its territorial claims in disputes with Southeast Asian nations and Japan. But the continuous engagement of the United States in the region enables other Asian nations to counterbalance China's economic and political influence. The swing between partial democracy and military dictatorship, and the actuation of Myanmar between the United States and China, is partly a result of U.S.-China competition over the region. Singapore, South Korea, the Philippines, Taiwan, Vietnam, and many other Asian states have also bolstered their economic and political, military ties with the United States at the same time as they are benefiting from increased economic integration with China. These Asian states have become a battleground where China and the United States are competing for influence. Similar dynamics can also be seen in South Asia and Central Asia. For example, in the 2015 presidential election in Sri Lanka, the challenger, Maithripala Sirisena, ran on an anti-China platform and defeated the two-term incumbent, Mahinda Rajapaksa, who had approved many large infrastructure projects to be built and financed by China. After the election, many Chinese projects were delayed or revisited by the new government. In the 2019 presidential election and 2020 parliamentary election, Mahinda Rajapaksa and his brother won back power. It is expected that Sri Lanka will tilt back toward China as China-backed projects regain momentum. In Pakistan, many regional elites see Chinese projects as enabling the central military elite to tighten its grip on their regions and resources. These projects, as well as the Chinese personnel involved, became the targets of local rebel groups. In 2017, Pakistan's government cancelled the Chinese-financed $14 billion Diamerbasha Dam project, citing harsh loan terms that involved pledging the new dam and an existing dam as loan security. Pakistan then turned to the IMF for emergency loans to deal with the balance of payment crisis that the CPEC helped precipitate. In response, the IMF asked Pakistan to reduce trade and commerce reliance on Beijing as a condition for the loan. In 2017, Nepal cancelled a $2.5 billion contract with Gazhuba Group, a Chinese company, for the construction of a hydroelectric plant. The government cited irregularities and corruption during the bidding process. In 2018, the Malaysian opposition ran on an anti-corruption platform, accusing the incumbent government of collaborating with China through the BRI and that this damaged Malaysia's national interests. Surprisingly, the opposition won the election and renegotiated many of the major Belt and Road projects with China after it took power. The Philippines' populist President Duterte, who constantly threatened to sever military ties with the United States and shifted allegiance to China, could not withstand domestic pressure and took a firmer stance by denying China's sovereignty claim in their territorial dispute. Beijing's efforts to expand its geopolitical influence by leveraging its rising economic dominance are not confined to Asia. Africa is another region where China's influence has been growing rapidly. Many African states carefully maintained good relations with China by supporting Beijing's position on political issues such as Taiwan's status and visits by the Dalai Lama. However, concern about Chinese colonialism started to emerge within Africa when labor disputes sometimes turned bloody and corruption charges involving Chinese companies increased. Opposition parties across the continent began to take advantage of the popular resentment against China's inroads by attacking incumbent governments for meeting China's demands at the expense of local interests. In the 2011 election in Zambia, the opposition party campaigned on an anti-China platform and successfully ousted the incumbent party. Concern about China's growing influence in Africa has reached a point where sitting governments that have a close relationship with China feel compelled to address this issue. In March 2013, just before the BRICS summit in Durban, the then governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, one of the African countries that has been most heavily reliant on Chinese loans, warned in the Financial Times that by embracing China, Africa is opening itself up to a new form of imperialism. China takes from us primary goods and sells us manufactured ones. This was also the essence of colonialism. Similar dynamics are at work in Latin America. The improvement in relations between the United States and Brazil during the Obama administration illustrates this dynamic. Brazil benefited significantly from the resource bonanza driven by Chinese demand, but at a substantial cost to the environment. The industrialist backlash against China's alleged mercantilist trade and currency policies has checked its influence in Brazil, which supported Washington's accusation of China's currency manipulation at the WTO. How the 2018 victory of Jair Bolsonaro, who accused China of buying up Brazil and identified it as a national security threat, will shape Brazil-China relations remains to be seen. In the general election in Peru in 2021, the hard-left candidate Pedro Castillo closely won on a platform that cast foreign mining companies, mostly Chinese, as neocolonial and called for the renegotiation of mining rights with foreign companies and for levying new taxes on them. Even Latin American countries once considered reliable allies of Beijing now sometimes act against Beijing's wishes. Venezuela is one such example. When the late socialist President Hugo Chavez broke with the United States, the principal consumer of Venezuelan oil, he turned to China as an alternative market and source of political support. Beijing provided the aforementioned loan for oil deal. When Venezuela's economy fell into deep crisis amid falling oil prices, the government of Chávez's successor, Nicolás Maduro, began to delay shipments of oil that were earmarked for loan repayment and, instead, to sell the oil in international markets for cash. Many Chinese companies subsequently left Venezuela without finishing their construction projects. When Maduro had difficulty securing more Chinese loans, he started turning to Wall Street again for credit in 2017. These challenges have constrained China's economic expansion into the developing world. China's export of capital and goods to the Belt and Road countries surged dramatically after Xi Jinping announced it as his pet project. But the growth of China's capital exports declined significantly from 2016, as shown in the outward FDI and loans data in Figure 9. The bottleneck for China's ambitious attempts to become a major capital exporter with an extensive sphere of influence is as much geopolitical as it is financial. Developing countries receiving Chinese investment and loans always had the United States and other great powers to fall back on. This has checked China's expanding influence. For China to overcome this bottleneck, it will have to overcome U.S. dominance in the global financial and geopolitical order. 4.4 Challenging the U.S. empire. So long as the global dollar standard, the Bretton Woods multilateral organizations, and the U.S. global military umbrella remain dominant, China's projection of its geopolitical influence will be constrained. Countries that China tried to absorb into its own orbit could often count on the United States to check China's growing influence. Beijing was well aware of this obstacle, and it has started exploring ways to create a parallel global currency system, multilateral institutions, and even security, military hard power to rival the United States. The rise of China as an export-oriented manufacturing powerhouse hinges its dependence on the USD. China's exports are almost totally invoiced in USD, just like Japan and the four tigers before it, and its payments for imports are also in USD. Its recycling of its foreign exchange reserves in U.S. Treasury bonds help sustain the global dollar standard and the US-led global financial architecture. The global financial crisis that started in the U.S. in 2008 and heavily damaged the USD's credibility urged China to rethink its dependence on the dollar. Starting in 2008, China promoted the international use of the RMB, hoping that China's external trade and its investment in AO and OUT could increasingly be settled in RMB instead of the dollar. The biggest challenge to the RMB's internationalization is that it is not a freely convertible currency, as the CCP never lets go of its control over the financial system to liberalize China's capital account. The RMB's inconvertibility dampens its global demand. Beijing's remedy was to promise eventual free convertibility of the RMB, while building up a freely convertible offshore RMB market in Hong Kong. International use of the RMB appeared to increase significantly in the years following the 2008 global financial crisis, though it was still trailing far behind international use of the euro, let alone the USD. The financial meltdown and drastic depreciation of the RMB in China in 2015, resulting from China's economic slowdown, overcapacity, and debt bubble as discussed in the last section, forced Beijing to tighten foreign exchange control again to stem capital flight. In the aftermath of the turmoil, Beijing prioritized financial stabilization and put RMB internationalization on the back burner. Today, most of China's trade and outward investment are still denominated in USD, as, overwhelmingly, are its external loans. Beijing's attempt to create an RMB currency bloc to reduce its dependence on the USD has so far been futile. But its aggressive push for RMB internationalization in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in 2008 did reveal China's intention of challenging USD hegemony. This intention kept the United States alert. In 2019, a U.S. Congress report claimed that RMB internationalization still maintains a certain momentum. This, in combination with the creation and rapid growth of the cross-border interbank payments system, a China-led international clearing system independent of the US-led SWIFT, could potentially create a China-led global financial system to challenge the US-led system. This financial system could become a lifeline for countries subject to US sanctions, including North Korea, Syria, Russia, and Iran. Besides attempting to set up a parallel global currency system, Beijing strives to reduce the backlash against its bilateral economic inroads into other developing countries by setting up its own multilateral institutions. These could provide a multilateral cover to China's economic expansion into the developing world. The creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in spring 2015 to finance infrastructure projects in Central, South, and Southeast Asia is a significant step in this approach. As of December 2017, the bank had 70 members, 44 from within and 26 from outside the Asian region, including some European countries. AIIB capitalization can potentially go up to $100 billion, China's pledged contribution is $50 billion. By the end of 2019, however, the total loans that AIIB had committed to and disbursed over the 4 years of its existence amounted to only $8.4 billion and $2.9 billion, respectively, far short of the initial expectation of an annual loan disbursement of $10 to $15 billion per year. 6. With the Obama administration's decision to boycott the AIIB, the competition between the United States and China over multilateral lending to the developing world became apparent. While refusing to join the AIIB, the United States established the International Development Finance Corporation in 2018, with an exposure cap of $60 billion as a response to the AIIB. If China's bilateral developmental assistance had been working well, it would not have needed to build new multilateral banks. China can lend alone, which allows it to maintain total control over which country tries to lend to and the terms of the loans. Lending through multilateral banks like AIIB constrains China's freedom of action because other stakeholders also have a say, despite China's veto power. Moreover, even though China is the largest contributor to the AIIB, it is still subject to the standards of existing multilateral lending institutions. China's efforts to start or support these multilateral institutions are attempts to diversify the risks of extending loans to other developing countries by sacrificing some of its power in dictating the terms of the loans. In contrast to speculation that the AIIB would become a vehicle to promote the international use of the RMB at the expense of the USD, the AIIB has little choice but to denominate the overwhelming majority of its loans in USD, as the demand for RMB loans is still minimal. While the total amount of committed and dispersed loans made by the AIIB has been far short of initial expectations, most of the loans have been in partnership with US-led multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank as co-lenders. In this co-financing with traditional multilateral banks, the AIIB relies on the traditional bank's expertise in assessing and shouldering the risks of its financed projects. Another challenge to China's attempt to project its influence to other developing countries is the inherent security risk and greater engagement cost. As more Chinese funds, personnel, and critical production facilities are distributed among developing countries, many of them unstable and ruled by unpopular regimes, Beijing faces increasing pressure to protect them. Thus, the sabotage of Chinese facilities and kidnapping of Chinese personnel in unstable areas has grown more frequent. Chinese nationals have reportedly become the #1 target for kidnapping by terrorists and rebel groups in Africa, and Chinese facilities are valuable targets for ransom demands. Militant and terrorist groups who see the Chinese inroads as a new imperialist incursion also target Chinese personnel and facilities for political reasons. The deadly attack by radical militants on the Chinese consulate in Karachi in 2018 was a case in point. Since 2013, Beijing has pledged to deploy the People's Liberation Army to protect its core interests overseas. So far, the PLA's overseas operations have mostly been through its participation in UN peacekeeping. The PLA also started to follow the examples of the United States, the UK, and France in stationing a force in Djibouti to help patrol the transportation choke point connecting the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, which is essential for international trade. But compared to the United States, Europe, and Russia, China's foreign direct military involvement is still minuscule. To make up for the lack of military projection capability, Beijing has been experimenting with international mercenaries to defend its overseas interests. In 2014, Eric Prince, the founder and former CEO of Blackwater, the security firm that became infamous for its actions in Iraq, was recruited to head the Frontier Services Group, a new Hong Kong-based logistics and security firm as a subsidiary to CITIC, China's biggest state-owned conglomerate. The FSG's main business is to provide security services to Chinese companies in Africa through a network of security subcontractors on the ground. In late 2016, the company announced that it was to adjust its corporate strategy to better capitalize on the opportunities available from China's One Belt, One Road development initiative. The FSG has been operating a large security training center in Beijing since 2017 and started building another one in Xinjiang in early 2019. China's cooperation with Eric Prince to establish the FSG is probably not intended to be a long-term solution for the protection of Beijing's overseas interests, but it addresses an immediate and growing need. China has already started developing its own security companies to provide services to Chinese entities overseas without the help of foreigners like Eric Prince. Some examples include the China Security and Protection Group, Huaxian Zhong'an, Beijing Dewey Security Services Limited Company, and China Overseas Security Group. China's rise as a capital exporter follows in the footsteps of other capitalist powers in history, which went abroad for economic reasons before finding the necessity to project their political and military power beyond their own sovereign space to protect overseas economic interests. What China is doing is not novel, it is the path of informal imperialist expansion that, historically, many developed countries have followed. It is ironic that, just as many Western scholars sympathetic to China deny the notion that China has gone imperial, since at least 2004 CCP leaders have started becoming more frank about China's imperative to learn about global power projections from historic imperial powers since the 15th century, including Spain, the Netherlands, the UK, France, and the United States. More recently, an influential official scholar of China with significant policy influence explicitly wrote that China should absorb the skills and achievements of the British and American empires to construct its own world empire for the sake of the Chinese people and the world. China's imperial turn fuels the growing anxiety of existing imperial powers, most of all the United States. It also worries many developing countries, which see increasing Chinese influence as a menace to their independent development and sovereignty. All developing countries that are experiencing expanding Chinese influence are now contemplating how to avoid the crossfire of the intensifying US-China rivalry. They also strive to benefit from such competition. Many countries see China's aid and investment as a viable counterbalance to pre-existing US influences, and vice versa. They frequently play China and the United States against each other. It is the typical dynamic of inter-imperial rivalry that we saw in the last century. 5. Conclusion: inter-imperial rivalry redux. In the aftermath of the Cold War, some saw the world as heading toward a clash of civilizations between established Western powers and the rising economic and demographic powers in the Sino and Muslim worlds. Some, on the other hand, saw the world as moving toward greater universal peace, unity under liberal democracy and free markets. Others saw the rise of a universal global capitalist empire, in which major capitalist powers united to dominate and carve up the world. But this debate is by no means new. The history of capitalism is rife with war and conflict. Since the inception of capitalist modernity, there has been discussion about whether it would ultimately lead us to perpetual peace or great wars among major capitalist powers. We see the same debate at the turn of the 20th century when the world saw an established capitalist power, the UK, facing intensifying challenges from rising latecomers, Germany and Japan. For Karl Koski, the end of Pax Britannica and the rise of new capitalist powers toward the end of the 19th century would not necessarily lead to conflict. Koski put forward a theory of ultra-imperialism, seeing that great capitalist powers could establish a joint cartel to divide and dominate the world together. The scramble for Africa in the Berlin Congress in 1878 and the joint imperialist invasion of China by great powers in 1900 can be seen as ultra-imperialism in action. Under this ultra-imperialist formation, great powers could be at peace with one another for a long time. Disagreeing with this prognosis, Lenin, building on the analysis of British economist J. A. Hobson, argued that great powers, when seeking to dominate the world through imperialist expansion, were destined to clash with one another. Any synergy among the great powers would, at most, be a temporary truce in between conflicts. Given the uneven pace of capitalist development among great powers, the division of the world based on the balance of power among those powers at any given point would certainly become outdated when the balance changed. This changing balance of power inevitably encouraged some powers to seek a redistribution of resources, which would inevitably lead to conflict. In the end, the two world wars vindicated Lenin's theory about the inevitability of great power conflict over Koski's theory of ultra-imperialist peace. While the configuration of the world order following the end of the Cold War is still in UX, the rise of US-China symbiosis in the 1990s, and its replacement by a US-China rivalry in more recent years, lead many to question whether the two greatest world powers are heading toward war or whether they will revert to a more harmonious relationship. In this element, I have borrowed insights from both Marxian and Weberian perspectives on international politics to unveil the economic and geopolitical origins of U.S.-China symbiosis around 1990 to 2010 and U.S.-China rivalry after c. 2010. We saw in Section 2 that, since the 1970s, U.S. corporations have been pushing for globalization as a remedy for their profitability crisis. In the early 1990s, they advocated for trade liberalization with China despite the foreign policy elite's tendency to see China as a new rival in the post-Cold War world. U.S. corporate efforts to lobby for U.S.-China trade liberalization in the early 1990s stemmed largely from Beijing's efforts to mobilize U.S. companies and turn them into its proxy lobbyists. This trade liberalization paved the way for China's accession to the WTO in 2001, heralding the heyday of Chimerica in the early 2000s. Over the 1990s, many of the foreign policy elite in the United States saw the prospect of conflict with China. Skirmishes between China and U.S. allies in the South China Sea increased, concern about China's contribution to nuclear proliferation in North Korea and Pakistan rose, and the notion that authoritarian China posed a threat to U.S. supremacy in Asia took hold. A great power competition between an established power and a rising power, a la Allison's Thucydides trap, seemed to be emerging. Yet, in reality, general relations between the two countries continued to improve, as the Wall Street-led corporate sector worked hard to foster a more amicable relationship with China. This development in U.S.-China relations in the 1990s shows the limits of the Thucydides trap thesis, which overlooks the significance of transnational economic linkages. Into the 2000s, U.S. preoccupation with the war on terror in Central and West Asia encouraged the foreign policy elite in Washington to seek a more cooperative relationship with Beijing on East Asian security. The alignment of corporate and geopolitical interests on the side of amity consolidated the Chimerica formation. At the apogee of the U.S.-China symbiosis, cleavages between U.S. corporations and China began to form. As U.S. corporate presence in China increased, so did intellectual property infringement cases and complaints about China's unfulfilled promises of market access. Initially, these conflicts were more or less contained. As we saw in Section 3, the business environment that U.S. corporations faced in China deteriorated significantly in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis and Beijing's mega-monetary stimulus of the state sector in 2009-10. Chinese enterprises faced an overcapacity and profitability crisis after the stimulus tapered off. With state regulatory and financial support, Chinese enterprises became more aggressive in appropriating technology and U.S. corporations' market share in the Chinese market. This turned many U.S. companies, which used to be proxy lobbyists for Chinese interests, into lobbyists for a more assertive policy against China. They were, at least, no longer eager to neutralize any confrontational policies originating from the foreign policy elite, which turned its attention back to U.S. competition with China in the West Pacific once the United States had exonerated itself from the war on terror in the 2010s. Increasing U.S.-China intercapitalist competition in the Chinese market eventually aligned U.S. corporate dispositions toward China with that of the foreign policy elite on the side of enmity. The changing alignment of U.S. corporate and geopolitical interests regarding China is summarized in Table 4. There is not a period in which U.S. corporations compete with their Chinese counterparts while the United States is China's geopolitical ally. We could put the U.S.-Europe or the U.S.-Japan relation there as a substitute. U.S. corporations always saw European and Japanese corporations as competitors, even as the United States was in a formal alliance with Europe and Japan under NATO and the U.S.-Japan Security Pact. Table 4 shows that while U.S. geopolitical interests have conflicted with China's most of the time, U.S. corporate interests vary. Only when corporate and geopolitical interests align on the side of enmity does Washington turn to a more antagonistic posture toward China. Varying U.S. corporate interests in China are, in turn, a result of China's changing political economy. Both the economic interests of capital and the geopolitical interests of the state are significant in shaping the US-China relationship. We saw in Section 4 that besides squeezing foreign enterprises in the domestic market, Chinese enterprises also sought to overcome their overcapacity through exporting excess capital to other countries with state support. China's desire to export capital underlines the inception of the BRI. This initiative offered Chinese goods and contractors a vast new market. Chinese companies' competition with U.S. corporations extended into BRI countries, many of whom had traditionally been U.S. allies. China must now project its geopolitical power to protect Chinese investments abroad. In creating its sphere of influence at the expense of that of the United States, China clashed head-on with the latter as an established geopolitical power. In sum, the combined and uneven development of U.S. and Chinese capitalism led to inter-capitalist competition between the two countries. This competition unleashed Washington's tendency to posit China as a geopolitical opponent, ripping apart the Chimerica formation and bringing about U.S.-China rivalry in Asia and beyond. This intensifying U.S.-China rivalry resembles the conflict between the UK and Germany in the early 20th century, as Lenin discussed. At the turn of the 20th century, Germany became a major capitalist power searching for overseas markets and outlets for its capital export. As it did not have many formal colonies like those of the UK, German capital export was led not by foreign direct investment but by German bank loans to support infrastructure projects, predominantly railroad construction, in Central and Southern Europe and Latin America, among other places. Borrowers of German loans were obliged to procure German products for their projects. German bankers competed with British and French banks in lending to Central Europe and Latin America. One such German-supported infrastructure project serving German business interests and geopolitical ambitions was the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad proposed by Wilhelm II. The project connected Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire and cut into British and Russian spheres of influence in the Near East, which became an increasingly important energy source when the world was transforming from coal to oil. The railroad also put Serbia at the epicenter of inter-imperial rivalry, contributing significantly to the outbreak of World War I. After World War I, Germany tried to internationalize its currency, the Reichsmark, in Central and Southern Europe to facilitate the export of German capital by increasing the use of Reichsmarks and creating a Reichsmarks bloc among those countries at the expense of the British pound. This intensified UK and German competition over Central and Eastern Europe, RST in the financial, monetary sphere and then in the political and military sphere. This policy resembles Beijing's attempt to internationalize the RMB and create an RMB economic bloc at the expense of the USD. The precedent of inter-capitalist competition turning into inter-imperial rivalry between the UK and Germany suggests that rivalry between the US and China is more likely to escalate than not, maybe even leading to war. Many observers have already noticed the comparability of China's sovereignty claims over areas controlled by US allies to Germany's irredentism in the early 20th century. It is noteworthy that many influential official scholars in China have openly compared China's foreign policy agenda of Great Revival to Germany's position just a century earlier. Works of German statist thinkers like the Nazi jurist Carl Schmitt became popular among prominent officials in Beijing who have the ears of state leaders. The clash between China, as a rising empire, and the United States, an established one, looks increasingly like the Germany-UK conflict in the early 20th century. The comparability between the US-China conflict today and the UK-Germany conflict a century earlier does not mean that war is inevitable. What is different in the 20th century is that now there are various global governing institutions over which the United States, China, and their allies could struggle for influence and so resolve their conflicts instead of settling scores through war. These struggles have already started. US-China competition over influence in the UN, the WTO, the World Health Organization, and other institutions has been growing over the last decade. Moreover, as Hobson points out, capitalist powers need to export capital in search of overseas protests when they fail to secure the higher incomes, and hence purchasing power, of the working class at home. This is necessary to absorb the excess productive capacity in their domestic economies. If domestic redistribution advances, the capitalist powers would have less need to export capital, and hence a reduced incentive to carve out their sphere of influence and thus collide with other powers. In China's context, if Beijing's attempts to rebalance the economy by boosting household incomes and household consumption succeed, the Chinese political economy's overcapacity, profitability crisis, and indebtedness would be alleviated. Chinese enterprises, and the Chinese state behind them, would have less incentive to squeeze foreign companies in China. They would be less prone to overseas investment too. Reviving protests through redistribution instead of intensifying zero-sum intercapitalist competition could contain the deterioration into interstate conflict. The same applies to the redistributive reform versus capital export through the pursuit of neoliberal globalization in the United States. Hobson's remedy for the avoidance of trade war, imperial expansion, and hence inter-imperial war more than a century ago still applies today. It is this economic condition of affairs that forms the taproot of imperialism. If the consuming public in this country raised its standard of consumption to keep pace with every rise of productive powers, there could be no excess of goods or capital clamorous to use imperialism in order to end markets. Foreign trade would indeed exist, but there would be no difficulty in exchanging a small surplus of our manufactures, and all the savings that we made could end employment, if we chose, in home industries. To be sure, such a rebalancing act, which hinges on breaking the corporate oligarchy's resistance to redistribution, is easier said than done. Based on our theoretical understanding of China's capitalist development and U.S. political economy, combined with a comparison with historical precedent, we are certain that the U.S.-China rivalry will only intensify in the years to come. Mediation by legitimate global governing institutions and the rebalancing of the Chinese and American economies are two approaches that could help alleviate the conflict. Only time will tell whether such approaches will succeed and whether they can successfully avert more deadly conflict.